Hey there. Tonight, we talk about the dark times. Not the ones with kings and crowns, but the quiet, grueling days in the lives of people who history rarely names. This is a story of smoke-thick cottages, thin soup, and the stubborn kind of hope that kept peasants alive through plague, hunger, and bitter winters. No books were written about them, but they endured. And that endurance, quiet, rough-edged, and unspectacular, is what held entire kingdoms together. This isn't a tale of glory. It's one of grit, warmth, and whispered prayers over cracked loaves and aching bones. If stories like this help you wind down or remind you how far we've come, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it? I love seeing where these quiet stories reach. So get cozy. Let the outside world hush for a while. And let's return to a time when survival itself was an everyday miracle. Tonight we begin in the aftermath, not of war or rebellion, but of something quieter and harder to see. A village sits still in the early morning frost. Chickens are silent. No one sings while fetching water. The usual rhythm of life, bells, footsteps, barking dogs, has been dulled to a hush. Something passed through here recently, something invisible but unforgettable. The fever came 2 weeks ago, sudden and merciless, and now everything feels touched by it. You can still hear it in the cough of the old man by the chapel wall, in the whisper of a mother praying beside a child who still won't wake. The wooden bowls go unfilled on certain doorsteps. The elder hasn't emerged from his hut. There are fewer voices in the fields. This is what it looks like when the plague doesn't strike like thunder, but settles like a fog. The peasants here are used to hardship, blighted crops, cruel winters, hunger that scrapes the ribs from the inside. But this is different. This is the sort of suffering that leaves no visible scar, and yet they endure. They always do. You might think of resilience as a loud thing, banners flying, speeches shouted. But here, resilience is quieter. It's waking up. It's washing your face with cold water and checking the grain stores again. It's kneeling beside a plot of soil and trusting that maybe something will grow again. There's grief here, yes, but there's also breakfast to prepare and goats to feed. A girl pulls her shawl tighter and heads to the well, careful not to slip in the frost. Her brother trails behind, rubbing sleep from his eyes with hands that are too small to have dug 2 graves already. This is what survival looks like at the edge of the map. Not heroic, not even defiant, just constant. The kind of strength that doesn't wait for applause because there's no one here to give it. There are no chroniclers, no parchment records, no carved names on stone. But history lives in these mornings, in the way a door is opened slowly, as if expecting something terrible behind it, in the way neighbors leave small bundles of garlic or dried leaves on one another's steps, not as medicine exactly, but as gestures against despair. You don't ask for help here, not because you don't need it, but because everyone does. And still, things move forward. Bread is baked, even if the dough rises reluctantly. Animals are tended, even if they've stopped giving milk. The sick are cared for with what little can be offered: wet cloth, whispered prayer, the comfort of being seen. No one expects miracles, but no one stops hoping for them either. The plague may have come and gone, or it may still be hiding in some forgotten corner of the village, but the people remain. Not untouched, but unbroken. And as the sun rises behind the trees, casting pale light across thatched roofs and smoke trails, the world dares to begin again. In the cold months, when the wind slips through the walls and the fields lie frozen under sheets of dull gray, the hearth becomes more than just a place to cook. It becomes the center of everything. A fire that never goes out, not because of some romantic tradition, but because letting it die might mean not surviving the night. Keeping the flame alive is a quiet duty, shared without discussion. Even the youngest in the household knows how to feed it dried twigs and blown breath. Someone is always watching the embers. If they fade too far, panic rises, not loudly, but with a sudden, sharp urgency. Fingers go black in this kind of winter. Bones ache from the cold before dawn. The fire isn't just warmth, it's light, it's safety. It's the only thing in the house that offers comfort without taking anything back. Around the hearth, meals are made from whatever can be spared. A bit of barley, some root vegetables, a scrap of fat. Children fall asleep beside it, curled like kittens on rush mats, while elders sit close, eyes reflecting the flicker. Smoke coils upward through a hole in the roof, sometimes clinging to the rafters if the wind outside shifts. The air inside is thick and close, but no one complains. Breathing smoke is better than freezing. In the darkest days, when the snow drifts high and the woodpile runs low, even the walls themselves feel like they're trying to lean in toward the heat. People press their backs to them anyway, trying to trap any warmth that leaks. Clothes are dried by the fire, boots are thawed there, and tears, if they come, are hidden in its glow. This is where stories are told, not for entertainment, but because they help pass the time between chores and sleep. Not fairy tales, but the kind of stories that tether people to the land. Who survived the last famine? Which child made it through a bad fever? How old Tom once brought in a calf during a snowstorm and kept it alive under his bed. These are survival tales, and every fire burns them into the memory of the room. Some nights, when the wind howls like it's searching for a way inside, people press closer to one another without saying why. No one is entirely sure if the sounds outside are wolves or spirits, or just the branches snapping under frost. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the fire still burns, that the light still pushes back against the dark, that there's a warm place to huddle when the rest of the world feels cold and distant and endless. The fire may be small, the room may be tight, but here, just here, there is life. And so through another long night, the hearth glows on, not bright, not fierce, but steady. And that in times like these is enough. The year the crops failed was not sudden. It never is. It begins with a late frost in spring that withers the seedlings before they stretch. Then come the rains that don't stop, or worse, the ones that never start. Everyone watches the sky that summer, not for beauty, but for answers. By midsummer, there are whispers. The barley isn't thickening. The rye is stunted. Potatoes haven't even broken the surface. Families begin to ration early, slicing bread thinner than ever before. The baker's loaves get smaller. A child bites into one and finds it gritty, full of husk and bark and something bitter. That's famine bread, a mixture of desperation and invention. Ground acorns, tree bark, dried weeds, anything to fill a belly. By autumn, no one's pretending anymore. The storehouse echoes. The bins are mostly dust and spider husks. What's left is saved for planting. But even that seems foolish now. People chew slowly. Meals stretch into rituals of silence. Each bite is counted, each bowl passed down the line with eyes averted. The stew pot never empties. It's always added to, watered down, reheated from the day before, flavored with memory more than substance. A sprig of garlic, a wrinkled carrot, the last bit of salt. People begin foraging for things they once ignored. Bitter roots, leaves with strange edges. There are debates over what's edible, what's dangerous, but eventually hunger overrides caution. The forest becomes both hope and threat. Old women with calloused hands teach younger ones how to peel nettles and boil them twice to soften the sting. Even the animals seem thinner, their ribs visible through fur and skin. Hens stop laying. Goats stop bleating. The sound of a pig being slaughtered becomes a village event, equal parts relief and mourning. Bones are boiled for days, then gnawed again, the marrow scraped with splinters of wood, and still it isn't enough. One morning, a girl faints while sweeping the yard. Her mother catches her before she hits the ground, but barely. They say it's the heat, but everyone knows it's not. It's hunger, stretched too far. The steward doesn't come this season, perhaps out of mercy, or fear, or maybe he, too, has no grain left to collect. Even the rats grow bolder, desperate. Some mornings you hear the soft scuffle of paws in the thatch and you let it be. Better them than your children. There's no energy left for rage, only for endurance. And so the people endure, quietly, without ceremony. They tie belts tighter, distract children with games to forget hunger, and keep moving, because movement keeps the cold away. Winter will come soon, and somehow they must meet it with less than nothing. But for now, they survive. One thin crust at a time, and even that, in a world collapsing into silence and ache, feels like a kind of victory. Pain was a teacher no one could avoid. It came without warning and stayed without mercy, becoming part of a person the way scars become part of skin. In a village like this, pain didn't have a name you could point to or medicine you could count on. It was something you learned to live beside, like a neighbor who never left. No one spoke of it too loudly. There was no use in complaining when there was work to do. A swollen knee meant walking slower, not stopping. A fevered brow meant someone else would fetch water, if they could. Children learned early not to cry too long after falling. They were hushed, not cruelly, but out of necessity. The sound of suffering was constant enough already. What mattered was recognizing the signs. A limp that got worse after rain, a cough that deepened in the cold, a sharp ache in the belly that came and went and maybe meant something. These were the body's own warnings, deciphered with no guide but instinct. An old woman might place her palm on a forehead and murmur that the heat was rising the wrong way. A man might chew willow bark because his grandfather once said it dulled the sharp edges behind the eyes. Blood was let with knives warmed by fire or pulled with leeches from a pond. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. But it was something, and something felt better than nothing. Herbs were crushed with stones and mixed into pastes or teas, their names remembered in fragments: yarrow, tansy, wormwood, half healing, half hope. No one knew exactly why they worked when they did or didn't, but there was comfort in ritual. You did what had always been done. A poultice was laid on a wound, wrapped in cloth, and bound with prayer. The line between treatment and protection was thin. Medicine was also charm, also faith. People hung dried herbs above doors, not because they believed it would save them, but because not doing it felt like asking for trouble. Pain was never absent, just tolerated better with age. A farmer with a bad hip adjusted the way he lifted his scythe. A mother with cracked hands wrapped them at night and rose anyway to cook. Even the animals, when limping or lame, were tended with care, because they too were part of the body of the village. There were no clean beds or trained healers, only kindness, memory, and hands willing to help. And when pain finally grew louder than anything else, when someone couldn't work, couldn't eat, couldn't move, there was still dignity in the quiet way they were carried near the fire, given broth, held by family. No screaming, no spectacle. Just the stillness of a body surrendering to something older than understanding. In a place where survival meant bending instead of breaking, pain wasn't a tragedy. It was a part of the story, a shadow beside you, a language everyone spoke in silence. They didn't fear the dead. Not exactly. Death was too common, too familiar, too woven into daily life to inspire the kind of horror we reserve for it now. What they feared was forgetting. that someone could die and vanish not only from the hearth, but from memory. So the villagers made quiet efforts to remember, not with gravestones, there were none here, but with ritual, with story, with small acts of care passed between hands and hearts. When someone died, they were washed, wrapped, and watched. Not alone, never alone. The body stayed in the home for a day or two, not as something to be hidden away, but to be honored. Candles were lit, prayers mumbled, and eyes were closed with fingers that trembled, not from fear, but from reverence. Children sat nearby, quiet but not hushed. Death wasn't hidden from them. It was part of their world from the start. They grew up knowing the names of those who weren't there anymore, learning how to place a hand on a shutter to keep it from slamming on the day of a burial, or how to scatter salt beneath a doorway. These acts didn't guarantee protection, but they offered a sense of doing something, of acknowledging that the veil between worlds had thinned. Some said the soul lingered for a time, hovering at windows or resting in corners of the room it had known. Bread was left out, a stool overturned, tiny signs of welcome or warning. And even when the body was taken, carried on a makeshift board to a spot near the edge of the trees where a few mounds already softened the earth, it didn't feel like the end. The departed remained part of the village, their names spoken in the pauses between work or murmured at the hearth in bad weather. Old Iwan would have known what to do with this storm, someone might say, and others would nod, not solemnly, but with affection. Sometimes, when a child asked about a patch of land or a broken fence, the answer wasn't practical. It was personal. That's where your uncle lost his boot, or that's where your sister saw the fox the day your father passed. Memory wasn't stored in books. It lived in footsteps, habits, and the way certain herbs were hung in the rafters just so. And on long dark nights when the wind made the shutters creak, the villagers didn't speak of ghosts, not really. They simply listened. To the silence. To the echoes of laughter that once filled the same space. To the creak of a floorboard that reminded them of someone long gone. The dead weren't feared because they weren't absent. They were part of the breath of the village, part of the soil beneath it. They lived on in the way someone shaped dough or cleared a path through the snow. They lived on in the remembering. And in a world where life was fragile, that remembering was a kind of resistance, a promise that no one vanished entirely. There were some things you didn't say aloud, not because you didn't believe them, but because speaking certain words felt like inviting something in. The villagers had no books, no formal spells, but they carried a vocabulary of fear passed down in whispers and warnings. A name spoken at the wrong hour, a joke made near the forest. Even an innocent song hummed during the wrong moon phase could be enough to draw uneasy glances. Everyone knew that misfortune could begin with something small, words twisted the wrong way or a glance held too long. That's why charms hung over doors, not to flaunt belief, but to offer quiet insurance. A braid of garlic, a silver button nailed to a beam, a dried toad's leg bound in cloth and placed beneath the hearth. Most people wouldn't explain them, not directly. They'd just shrug and say, "That's how it's always been." But if you asked the right person on the right day, you might learn that one family once avoided a fever after tying red thread around their child's wrist, or that old Lena swore her cow survived because she buried a hair comb under the threshold. It wasn't logic. It wasn't madness. It was survival, shaped by desperation and memory. The line between religion and folklore was thin. People crossed themselves at shadows. They muttered the names of saints alongside phrases that didn't belong in any church. A child with a stubborn cough might be passed through the split trunk of a young tree to let the sickness slip out. Bread dropped on the floor had to be kissed before it was eaten. If the wind howled from the north, you stirred your stew counterclockwise. Not doing these things didn't always lead to trouble, but when trouble came, and it always did, it felt better to have done something, to have followed the invisible rules. There were also names that no one used, not for people, for things. The figures in the woods, the ones said to follow travelers who walked alone too late. They weren't devils exactly, nor were they animals. They were the ones who lived just beyond the edge of knowing. When crops failed or children fell ill without cause, it was sometimes blamed on a look or a word, a curse, perhaps unintentional, from someone desperate or bitter. And because they had no way to prove or disprove it, the fear stuck. People became cautious with language. They spoke in riddles when discussing misfortune. They avoided naming the thing they feared, preferring phrases like the gray sickness or the dark one's breath. Even joy was spoken carefully, lest it tempt fate. No one ever said, "This year's been good," without knocking on wood or spitting over their shoulder. These weren't superstitions to them. They were guardrails on a road carved by centuries of suffering. When nothing else was certain, words held power, so you chose them wisely. And you spoke the dangerous ones only in your head, or never at all. They called it the sick season. Not officially, not with any calendar or announcement, but everyone knew when it began. The wind changed. The air felt heavier. Children's noses ran longer, and old people sat quieter. It usually came in the weeks after the harvest, when the days grew short and the nights pulled their breath in tight. No one knew what caused it. Bad air, perhaps, or evil spirits, or something lingering in the damp straw. But once it started, it moved fast. First a cough, then a fever, then silence from a house you used to hear laughter from. Families closed their shutters, not to keep the cold out, but to keep the sickness in, or maybe to keep others away. The chapel bell would ring a little more often, and people would start looking at one another differently. Was that just a sniffle? Or something more? The baker wrapped his mouth in a cloth. The midwife stopped visiting unless it was urgent. Neighbors dropped food at doorsteps and knocked with the heel of a boot instead of the hand. Inside the homes, care looked like survival. A mother sat beside her son, wiping sweat from his temples with a cloth that was already damp from the last fever. A brother stirred onion broth over a weak flame, hoping the smell alone might coax appetite. They spoke in low tones, partly out of respect, partly out of fear that louder words might push the illness deeper into the chest. Beds were made from whatever was soft, wool, hay, sometimes just spare clothes, and people slept upright when lying down made the lungs rattle too much. Time lost meaning. Daylight blurred into darkness. You measured progress by breathing, by color returning to the lips, by whether someone could keep down a spoonful of stew. And if they improved, the joy was hushed. No one celebrated too early, but if they worsened, it was even quieter. The fire was stoked, not for heat, but because flame was thought to keep the soul anchored. Hands were held, psalms were whispered, and sometimes someone would sit beside the sick, not to help them recover, but to help them pass. Not alone, not afraid, just seen. Some houses lost one person, others lost three, and yet the village held. Not because it was strong, but because it had no other choice. Life did not pause for grief. Goats needed feeding, wood needed chopping. Even in sickness, chores whispered their demands. And when the sick season ended, because it always did eventually, the village returned to motion slowly. Like a body waking from cold, shutters opened again, children played again. Someone began singing while kneading bread. But they didn't forget. The names of the lost were stitched into silence, their blankets reused, their tools passed on, their voices echoed, faintly, in the way people lowered their tone when talking about the wind. It wasn't healing, not exactly, but it was something close. Every evening, when the light slipped low and the smoke began curling from the rooftops, Families gathered around the hearth with the same quiet urgency: a bowl, a fire, and 10 mouths to feed. That was the reality most nights. The food was simple, almost always the same. Pottage bubbling in a pot that never fully emptied, just added to day after day. Barley, dried peas, cabbage leaves, maybe a bone if the family was lucky. Meals weren't occasions, they were calculations. How many spoonfuls could be spared? How thin could the stew be stretched and still be called food? The mother always served last. She would ladle the bowls in silence, eyes flicking over each face, knowing who had worked hardest that day, who looked paler than usual, who might be hiding hunger behind politeness. Children rarely asked for more. They had learned early that second helpings only came when someone else went without. Sometimes a bit of hard bread was passed around to soak up the last of the broth, stale, cracked at the edges, but precious all the same. No one wasted. A dropped crumb was retrieved and eaten. The fire crackled and conversation came in low voices, not because of secrecy, but because the day had already taken so much energy. They talked about the animals, the weather, small bits of gossip, nothing heavy. There was no room for dreaming, only planning. What to do if the frost came early, how long the turnips might last, whether the goat's limp would heal on its own. And yet, in that sparse meal, there was a kind of grace, a shared ritual that reminded everyone they were still alive, still holding on. Hunger wasn't new. It hovered in the corners like smoke, never quite fading. But so did kindness. A boy might slide a bit of bread toward his younger sister when no one was watching. An old woman might pretend not to be hungry so others could eat. These weren't grand sacrifices, just small daily ones that kept the family upright. The children sometimes played a game with their food, naming the lumps in the stew. This one's a dragon tooth. That one's a wizard's finger. It made the meager contents seem magical for a moment. And laughter, rare as it was, warmed the room more than the fire. The father might tell a story while chewing slowly, something half-true about a king who disguised himself as a beggar. Everyone knew the tale already, but they listened anyway. Afterward, bowls were scraped clean with bread crusts, then licked clean when the bread was gone. The pot was rinsed with hot water, and the ashes from the fire were stirred to keep the coals warm for morning. Bellies weren't full, not really, but they were less empty than before. And in a world ruled by cold nights and thin seasons, that was enough. The family slept close, smoke in their hair, hunger in their bones, but together. And that more than the food was what helped them survive another day. At night, when the fire had burned low and the house fell into its soft chorus of snores, breath, and creaking timbers, there was another world waiting behind the eyelids. Dreams, to the medieval peasant, were not idle stories. They were messages, warnings, visitations. Sleep was a time of passage. You didn't just rest, you drifted. The line between body and soul blurred. People believed dreams came from the divine, or sometimes from something darker. A good dream might mean health, luck, even a coming child. A bad one, blood in the river, a tooth falling out, a crow in the window, could mean sickness, famine, or death. And people took them seriously. A man who dreamed of fire would check the thatch twice the next day. A woman who saw her dead mother in a dream might light a candle the next morning without telling anyone why. Dreams weren't always shared, but when they were, it was with caution. You'd mention it in the fields maybe, speaking into the wind as if unsure whether the words should stay. I dreamed of the chapel bell ringing at midnight. Then you'd wait to see if anyone else had heard it. And if someone had, you'd both go quiet. There was no need to say more. Children were taught early to listen to their dreams, not to fear them, but to respect them. If they dreamed of falling, or drowning, or being chased, they were told to sleep with iron under their pillows. A blade or nail would do. Some hung herbs from the rafters to ward off nightmares. Others tied tiny charms beneath their straw mattresses. But some dreams couldn't be stopped. The kind that woke you breathless, that made you sit up in the dark and stare at the shadows on the wall, listening for something that might still be in the room with you. Those nights stretched long. You'd wait for the fire to crack again, for the familiar stirrings of those around you, and slowly the fear would fade. Dreams came in two waves, they said. First sleep, then waking, then a second, deeper sleep. That waking gap in the middle of the night was considered sacred, an in-between time, when the world was still and the veil between things was thin. People rose then, moved about quietly, whispered prayers, or just stared into the hearth. If you shared a strange dream during that hour, it was believed to be truer, closer to the bone, and the next day, the dream might shape your choices in ways you wouldn't admit aloud. You'd avoid a road, wait a day to mend a fence, say no to an offer of meat. Dreams weren't just stories, they were instructions. Sometimes confusing, sometimes cruel, but never empty. And in a world where so much was uncertain, where death came without warning, and life demanded constant vigilance, that nighttime voice, mysterious as it was, offered something like guidance. Not always clear, not always kind, but it reminded you that even sleep was never without consequence. He arrived just after sunrise, leading a mule and wrapped in layers of dust-colored wool. A traveling monk, or so he said. The villagers watched him from their doorways, from behind shutter slats, from the edges of the path where carts had long ago carved muddy scars into the earth. Strangers rarely came through. When they did, they brought either news or trouble, and often both. This one was lean, quiet, and carried a satchel filled with scrolls no one here could read. He spoke with a calm voice, soft and slow, as if each word weighed something. Said he had come from the east, past rivers with names no one recognized. Said he'd walked through villages, struck silent by plague. That was the word he used, plague, and it drifted through the air like smoke. Some villagers crossed themselves. Others simply turned away. But still, they listened. The monk asked for a place to sleep, and an old couple gave him their goat shed, swept out and laid with straw. In return, he spoke of things most had never heard, of burning incense in churches to drive away sickness, of towns where no one left their homes for weeks, of how people marked their doors with crosses and ash. He showed them dried herbs, bitter and sharp-smelling, wrapped in waxed cloth. He called them protection. A few took them. Most didn't. There was something unsettling about the calmness with which he spoke, as if the end of things was a familiar shape to him. That night he was invited to the chapel, not to preach, but to speak. The room was cold, the stone altar flanked with candles, the benches packed. People leaned forward as he described how a man could wake healthy and fall dead by sunset, how a mother might nurse her child and not rise from the floor. But he didn't speak to frighten them. His words were laced with something else, resignation maybe, or understanding. He spoke of courage too, of how kindness became currency during sickness, how entire villages learned to care for each other in silence. He warned of fear turning neighbor against neighbor, of the temptation to seal doors and forget the names of the dying. And then he prayed, head bowed, voice low and even, asking for mercy, not just from the heavens, but from each other. The next morning, he was gone, left behind a handful of herbs on the chapel bench and a silence that lingered like dew. No one spoke of him directly, but people walked a little more slowly past their neighbors' homes, left more bundles of kindling on stoops, spoke more gently to the children. Whatever he brought, news or warning, or just the shape of a stranger's face, settled into the village like an echo. No one could say what exactly changed, only that something did. And in a place where change usually meant loss, this time it felt almost like preparation. She lived just beyond the last fence, where the fields gave way to thickets and the path turned narrow. Her hut was tilted like it had grown tired of standing straight, with herbs hanging in bunches from the eaves and smoke curling from a crooked chimney, even in summer. People called her the herb wife, though no one remembered if she'd ever had a husband. Children were told not to bother her, though they often watched her from a distance, wide-eyed as she knelt beside unfamiliar plants and whispered to herself. She wasn't feared exactly, but she wasn't fully trusted either. Still, when the coughs began or fevers wouldn't break, they came, quietly, after dark. They'd knock and wait, and she would open the door without surprise, as if she'd already known they were coming. Her hut smelled of earth and ash and something sharp, vinegar or garlic or crushed stems. Inside, shelves sagged beneath bundles of dried leaves, jars of cloudy liquid, pouches tied with twine. She didn't speak much. She asked questions with her eyes, then handed over what she thought might help: a bitter tincture, a wrapped compress, a cloth bag to be hung by the window. Payment was loose: a fish, a bolt of wool, once even a song. She never asked for coin. People said she knew more than she let on, that she could sense sickness before it came, that she had once brought a baby back with only smoke and prayer. Others whispered that she had been spared during the last plague when her whole family had fallen, that she had seen something in the fever dreams and never spoke again except to the plants. Truth blended with rumor, and no one dared sort it out. What mattered was that her remedies often worked, at least enough to bring comfort. And when they didn't, she sat with the dying, unflinching, like she'd been there before. One night, a boy came running to her door, breathless, saying his sister couldn't breathe. She didn't speak, just grabbed a bundle of cloth and followed him barefoot through the frost. She stayed at their home for 2 days, feeding the girl broth and laying hot stones at her feet. The girl lived. That was enough for the village to accept her a little more, though never completely. The priest didn't trust her, said her ways were not of the church. But he didn't stop her either. Not when she was the only one who could name the plants that grew near the creek. Not when people whispered her name in fear and in need. She remained at the edge of the village, in her crooked hut, speaking in leaves and smoke and silence. A line between worlds, neither holy nor cursed, just necessary, and in a place where illness could strike as suddenly as lightning, where pain was constant and hope was fragile, necessity was a kind of sacred all its own. Inside the peasant's home, the air was never quite clear. Smoke drifted just above head height, softening the outlines of everything it touched. It clung to hair, to wool, to skin. It hung heavy in the morning and thickened at dusk, curling from the hearth where a fire burned day and night, its breath steady and low. There was no chimney, only a hole cut crudely in the roof where some of the smoke escaped and the rest lingered. If you entered from outside, your eyes would sting at first, but within minutes you stopped noticing. You breathed it in like breath itself. The hearth was the center of the home, cooking pot, light source, heat in winter, and everything radiated from it. The pot hung from an iron hook, suspended over coals that were never allowed to die completely. Meat was rare, but when it came, it sizzled in that pot. More often, it was porridge or stew, left simmering until it thickened and darkened into something hearty enough to satisfy a dozen mouths. Herbs dried overhead in little bundles, turning the smoke fragrant when the wind shifted just so. Behind the hearth, soot crawled up the wall in blackened veins, drawing silent patterns that no one bothered to scrub away. It was as much a part of the house as the rafters. In summer, it trapped heat, turning the home into a smoky oven. In winter, it was the difference between warmth and frostbite. But the smoke did more than warm and cook. It protected. People believed it warded off evil, kept away sickness, preserved food, and cloaked them from whatever spirits drifted through the night. It was a shield, even if it stung. Children would lie close to the fire, coughing lightly in their sleep, their faces flushed red and hair glistening with sweat. Mothers tucked them in with damp cloths and wiped away ash from their cheeks. Men came in from the fields, reeking of earth and smoke, and they sat close, pulling off boots and reaching out their hands to the heat like pilgrims at an altar. The walls, made of wattle and daub, breathed smoke in and out with the seasons. Birds sometimes nested in the rafters, their feathers blackened by the same air that warmed the family. No one thought it strange. To live meant to live with smoke, to carry its scent on your clothes, to smell it in your hair, to wake with it in your throat. It softened everything: edges, voices, memories. Some swore they could see shapes in it at night, faces or figures, though whether that was faith or fatigue was never clear. Still, when the fire burned low and the room fell quiet, the smoke seemed to hold the whole family in its arms. Cradled in gray, breathing in time with the hearth, they survived. Not in spite of the smoke, but because of it. It choked and it sheltered. It hurt and it healed. And like everything else in their world, it was both burden and blessing. No one in the village had ever seen the river. Not really. They spoke of it like they might a distant saint or a sleeping dragon. Something real, yes, but real in the way a shadow is real. It was said to lie far to the north, past the hills and forests, beyond the places where most dared to walk. They knew of it only through stories carried by travelers or murmured by old men beside the fire. The river fed towns, split kingdoms, and carried fish so fat they glistened like silver. It also, the stories warned, carried disease. Water, though sacred and vital, was never entirely safe. Even in the village, where people fetched it from shallow wells or narrow brooks, caution was part of every cup. The buckets came up muddy some days, the surface tinged with a strange oil sheen. You drank anyway. What else could you do? There was no boil and filter, no clean spout of metal pipes. Sometimes they let it settle, waited for the bits to sink, then drank the top half with eyes closed. And if someone fell sick after, it was never quite blamed on the water. Not directly, it was just bad luck. Or perhaps they forgot to bless the well that week. Or perhaps something had died upstream. Animals did that sometimes. Wander into the water and float there, bloated and still, unnoticed until someone downstream began to cough. Wells were watched carefully. If a bucket came up smelling sour, it was avoided for days, sometimes weeks, until someone brave enough or desperate enough tried again. There were signs to look for. A frog near the stones was good luck. A drowned bird was a bad omen. Old women might mutter a prayer before dipping their pails, pressing a thumb to the rim before drinking. Children were warned not to linger too close. They might fall in, or worse, stir something that shouldn't be disturbed. In hard years when the rains didn't come, the water ran low and thick, dark with silt, and filled with things that didn't belong. Those were the years people whispered about the river again, wondering if someone might fetch water from it, despite the distance. But no one ever did. The road was too long, the forest too dense, the danger too uncertain. They kept to their own muddy pools, trusted to luck and habit, and shared tales of the great river that carried kings and plagues alike. And so the river remained a distant idea, a thread in the tapestry of their survival. Water, even in its foulest form, was life, but it was also risk. They drank it with reverence and suspicion, both grateful and wary. And every drop that didn't turn their stomach or bring a fever felt like a small mercy. In a world where the line between nourishment and poison was thin and shifting, water was never just water. It was a wager, a hope poured from wood and rope. And still, Every morning, the buckets went down again. It began with a strange smell, not foul exactly, but sour and earthy, like something that had forgotten how to be food. The grain looked normal at first: barley, rye, maybe some oats, scooped from the storage bin with the same wooden ladle they'd used all winter. But something was off. A dust clung to it. The texture felt wrong in the hand. A few villagers coughed more than usual after baking. One boy vomited after eating a crust of bread. Still, it was all they had, so they kept eating. You don't throw out grain when the fields are bare and the steward's tithe is due. Bread is life, until it isn't. That spring, more villagers fell ill. Not with fever or cough, but with twitching hands, burning limbs, and confused eyes. Some saw things that weren't there: colors in the sky, shadows that spoke. A woman screamed that ants were crawling beneath her skin. Another man collapsed in the field, limbs twisted, mouth foaming. The elders had seen it before. "Rotten grain," someone whispered. "God's curse," said another. But those were just different names for the same thing. Ergod, a fungus that grows on wet rye, invisible until it's too late. No one knew the word, but they knew the sickness. Some called it holy fire because of the burning sensations it caused. Others called it the devil's hunger. Whatever the name, it came without mercy. Whole households were struck. Some died quickly. Others lingered in agony. And still people ate. What else could they do? Starve? Starvation was its own kind of death, just slower, more familiar. They began to sift the grain more carefully, using cloth and hope. They baked bread longer, believing that fire might kill whatever lived in the flour. They prayed. The chapel filled with the smell of tallow candles and old fear. People made offerings of whatever they could spare: goose feathers, salt, herbs, anything that might buy back the health that had slipped through their fingers. The steward didn't visit that season. Perhaps he'd heard, or perhaps he had his own troubles elsewhere. One family burned their entire store of rye and survived the year on roots and borrowed turnips. Others weren't so lucky. By midsummer, the sickness faded, leaving its mark not just on the bodies it had ravaged, but on the way the villagers looked at their bread, with suspicion, with caution. Every loaf was broken with more care, every bite followed by a silent prayer. They learned to dry their grain better, to watch for dampness, to store it higher off the floor. Small things, but survival often came down to small things. And even when the rot didn't come, the memory of it lingered. In the cracks of the wooden bins, in the lines etched deeper on old faces, in the way children sniffed at flour before kneading it. Bread was still life, but now it was also a reminder that even the most sacred things, when touched by time and moisture and misfortune, could turn against you. You could hear him before you saw him, hooves on packed earth, slow and deliberate. The steward never rode fast through the village. He didn't need to. His presence carried weight enough without speed. The children went quiet first. Then the dogs stopped barking. Doors didn't slam, but they closed, slowly, as if hoping not to be noticed. The steward wore dark wool and a leather pouch strapped to his belt. Inside it, ink, quills, and a record of what each family owed: grain, eggs, wool, sometimes coin, though few had it. He didn't smile, didn't shout. He didn't have to. He would dismount near the chapel, nod to the priest, and wait. One by one, the villagers came forward, not willingly, but not defiantly either. Just inevitably. His eyes scanned each face, lingering on patched sleeves and sunken cheeks. He asked how the crop had fared, whether the goat had birthed healthy. He took notes when people spoke, not nodding, not disagreeing, just listening in that way that made people nervous. Because it wasn't about whether the answers were true, it was about whether they were acceptable. When he visited a home, he didn't enter unless invited, but the weight of his boots on the threshold was enough to make hearts race. He would glance at the hearth, at the size of the bread on the table, at how many mouths looked back at him. He rarely accused, never threatened. He simply reminded them that the Lord owned the land, that the mill was not free, that the oven cost coin, that marriage required permission, that survival, for all its hardship, still existed within rules. Sometimes he asked for payment in kind, a sack of barley, a bolt of wool, a chicken. If none could be offered, he made a mark in his book, a small stroke, but one that could grow into consequences. And yet, for all his power, he was still human. Once his horse lost its shoe near the pasture, and 2 boys were sent to fetch the blacksmith. They returned with mud up to their waists, and for a moment he actually laughed. Not kindly, not cruelly, just surprised. It was the only time anyone remembered seeing his teeth. When he left, it was with a cart heavy or light, depending on the season. The village exhaled behind him, slowly, like a lung releasing pressure. There was no celebration after a steward's visit, only quiet inventory, whispered reassurances, and 1 or 2 muttered curses into the dirt. But still they complied. Because not complying meant fines, or loss of land, or worse, attention from those even higher up. The steward wasn't a villain, he was a reminder that even in their tiny corner of nowhere, the outside world still reached in with ink and law and expectations. That survival didn't just mean enduring the cold or the hunger, but navigating the quiet demands of power. And in a world where every grain counted, giving even a little could feel like bleeding. But they gave, because they always had, and because they had to. Bathing wasn't something done for comfort. It wasn't warm, relaxing, or regular. It was cold, awkward, and usually necessary only when the dirt began to feel like a second skin. In the village, to bathe was to risk catching chill, to remove the grime that had come to feel like a layer of protection. Water was precious, and warm water was rarer still, requiring firewood, time, and the indulgence of something that didn't feed or clothe you. Still, people washed. Not fully, not often, but in parts. Hands after butchering, feet before sleep, faces when the sun came up, especially before feast days or chapel visits. Full immersion, though, was rare, maybe a few times a year, often in spring when the rivers ran high and the air no longer bit. For women, bathing was both more private and more dangerous. Privacy meant exposure. Going to the river alone risked more than a chill. So they washed indoors when they could, using buckets behind cloth screens, while others respectfully averted their gaze. The water was reused, first by the eldest, then passed down to the youngest. It wasn't clean by modern standards, but it was cleaner than the alternative. Soap was a luxury, often made from lye and animal fat, stinging the skin and leaving a sharp smell. It wasn't used often, but when it was, it cut through grease like fire. Most relied on ash and sand, rough but effective. Scrubbed onto elbows, behind ears, under fingernails, not for beauty but for decency, to avoid judgment, to prevent rashes and infections. The idea of cleanliness wasn't tied to moral virtue or social status. It was a matter of practicality. Too much filth led to sores. Sores led to illness. Illness spread. And in a household where everyone lived shoulder to shoulder, even a single sickness could tip the balance of survival. Clean clothes were relative. Garments were shaken out, brushed down, laid in sun and smoke. Freshness came from wind, not water. And the scent of herbs, mint, lavender, or thyme, tucked into folds of linen offered the illusion of purity. People didn't think of themselves as dirty. They thought of themselves as functional. The line between the two was thin, and mostly it didn't matter. What mattered was health, was not itching, was being able to move through your day without raw skin or rot setting in. And when illness came, water was used carefully, blessed sometimes, warmed in clay pots, carried with reverence, to wash the brow of the fevered, to clean the body of the dying, to say in those final acts that the person mattered, that they would leave this life not as something soiled, but as someone seen. In this way, bathing became sacred, not because it was indulgent, but because it was rare, deliberate, and tied to moments that broke the ordinary rhythm of existence. A ritual of care, a pause in the dirt-stained blur of survival, a reminder that even in a world ruled by labor and suffering, there was still space, however brief, for renewal. It was the cold that took them, not suddenly, not cruelly, just slowly. Winter didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept. A few cold mornings, a harder frost, the first ice in the bucket beside the hearth. And then one day, the ground simply stopped giving, the wind grew teeth, and the sun became a dull ornament in the sky. The fire was no longer just comfort, it was the center of the world. Families gathered around it like pilgrims, every log a blessing, every coal preserved like gold. But no matter how long the fire burned, the cold still got in. Through the walls, through the floor, through the holes in boots and the thin parts of patched up cloaks. And in the houses where the firewood had already run low, the cold became another inhabitant. It sat in corners. It curled up in the bedding. It crept into lungs and made each breath sting. People didn't die from it exactly. They died from what came with it, from the infections that festered in chapped skin, from lungs that refused to clear, from a kind of tiredness that made getting up in the morning feel like dragging a stone through snow. Elders went first, often without complaint. They'd sit closer to the hearth and say little, then less, then nothing. One morning they wouldn't wake and no one was surprised. Sad, yes, but not shocked. They'd made it through dozens of winters. This one had just come heavier. Children fared better, if there was enough to eat, if the roof held, if someone had a coat to pass down. But even they weren't safe. A cough could become something else. A fall on ice could mean a fever. Every scrape was a threat. You learned to move less, to conserve, to let your breath fog the air and keep it close, like a blanket. Some families shared beds, slept with animals, layered themselves in every bit of cloth they owned. Straw was stuffed into cracks in the wall. Snow was swept from the doorstep with branches. Meals were thinner. Stews stretched across days, and the last of the salted pork was eyed with a kind of mourning. And yet, life didn't stop. Even in that brutal season, there was work. Goats needed milking. Tools needed sharpening. And every few days, someone had to break through the ice at the well just to bring back water. The cold punished everyone, but it united them too. Neighbors brought bundles of wood without being asked. A spare scarf was left on a post. No thanks needed, just survival. And when the thaw finally came, when birds sang again and the earth softened underfoot. It felt like a kind of resurrection. Those who had endured looked around at their weathered homes, at the faces thinner but still alive, and said little, just nods, just quiet gratitude. The cold had taken what it would, but it had left something too, proof that they were still here, that the fire had held, that beneath layers of frost and silence, life had endured once again. She lived at the very edge of things, where the fences ended and the woods began to reclaim the land. Her house leaned like it had given up resisting the wind. No husband, no children, no chapel visits either. Just her and the rows of herbs drying in bundles under the thatch, and a garden that still grew even when others failed. People didn't speak her name often, not in full daylight. But when a baby wouldn't sleep, when a wound wouldn't close, when the midwife looked uncertain and the priest said only to pray, then someone was sent. Always after dark. They would knock gently as if hoping she might not answer, but she always did. She was old, or at least seemed so, hair long and gray, hands stained with the deep green of crushed plants. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. She never smiled, but neither did she scowl. She listened more than she spoke, asked for no payment, though people often left food, firewood, or thread behind them. What she gave was not always understood. A tea brewed from something bitter and black, a cloth dipped in a pungent infusion, a charm sometimes to hang over a cradle. Was it magic? The priest would say so, but those who had seen it work didn't ask too many questions. They just remembered the way fever had broken after her visit, or how the bleeding stopped when her poultice was pressed to the skin. They remembered the herbs that smoked in the fire and filled the room with a scent that clung to your clothes for days. Some said she spoke with animals. Others swore she'd once cured a cow with nothing but a touch. All agreed on one thing: she knew something they didn't. And that knowledge carried a kind of weight, respect and fear, both. Children dared each other to run past her hut at night. Men joked, but only when she was far enough away not to hear. Women, though, they went to her more than anyone, for help with childbirth, for protection, for quiet understanding when no one else would listen. And she never turned them away. She lived alone, but was never truly apart. Her remedies wove into the fabric of the village, invisible but present. A tincture here, a dried root there. A whispered instruction passed from mother to daughter. Boil it twice. Never drink it cold. No one called her healer. No one called her witch. She was just there, watching, waiting. And when she passed, years later, in her bed, with herbs still hanging from the beams and her cat curled beside her, the village mourned her like they would a tree uprooted. Quietly, deeply, they buried her near the woods where the shade was thick and the soil soft. And in spring, the first flowers to bloom in the village grew above her grave, without planting, without tending, just as if they knew where they were needed. No one wanted to say it, but the bread was gone. Not entirely. There were still crumbs, still the dry, cracked heels of loaves hiding at the bottom of baskets. But the soft center, the warmth, the fullness that bread once promised had long since vanished. It had been weeks of cutting thinner and thinner slices, pretending to be full, pretending it would stretch. Mothers gave their portion to children. Fathers made jokes about eating air with a straight face. But now the lie had run out. The bread was truly gone. It wasn't just food. It was ritual, stability, a measure of the day. Without bread, people stared longer at empty plates, unsure how to begin a meal, or whether it counted as a meal at all. The oven sat cold. The smell of baking, once the heart of the home, was absent. In its place, the metallic tang of boiled weeds, the sharpness of onion water, the dullness of overcooked cabbage. Hunger changed everything. People spoke more slowly, or not at all. Arguments started and fizzled quickly, too costly to carry. Children moved less. Laughter shrank to silence. The village itself seemed to grow smaller, as if drawing in to preserve what little strength it had. When the stew was served, and stew now meant mostly water, it was poured carefully, slowly, as if that might make it richer. People looked away while others ate, ashamed of their own emptiness. The priest gave more sermons on humility, on suffering, on God's tests. Some listened, others did not. Not because they doubted, but because even faith needed feeding. The old ways returned. People foraged, gathering nettles, roots, dandelion greens. Anything green became precious. A rabbit caught in a snare was a miracle. Grain, if found, was ground with stones that wore the hands raw. Bark was boiled, mixed with flour, baked into cakes so hard they could crack a tooth. Famine bread, they called it. A meal not meant to nourish, but to fool the stomach into quiet. And still, people went on. They woke up. They worked what land they could. They chewed slowly. They wrapped tighter at night, as if cold and hunger might cancel each other out. There were whispers, as there always were, of other villages starving, of fields rotting in the north, of caravans too afraid to travel, of nobles burning surplus grain to drive up prices. True or not, the whispers burned in the heart, made the hunger feel sharper. Still, no one ran. Where would they go? Hunger followed everywhere. Instead, they endured, teeth clenched, mouths dry, eyes watchful, waiting for the season to shift, for the rains to come, for the soil to remember how to give again. And when a single loaf was finally baked again, small, flat, nearly burnt, it was passed hand to hand like a relic. No one dared eat the first bite, not out of fear, but reverence, because after all that silence, all that waiting, the return of bread felt like a resurrection. A promise that life, though starved and staggering, had not yet given up. The first time it happened, no one said a word. The pig was simply gone. The pen gate was unlatched. The straw inside disturbed. And the trail of muddy prints ended at the edge of the woods. No squeals. No sign of a struggle. Just absence. The owner, a man who had raised that pig from a pink, squirming runt, walked slowly around the pen twice, then stood staring at the empty trough. His wife didn't ask. His children didn't speak. Everyone already understood. The pig hadn't wandered off. It had been taken, and not by a stranger. A stranger wouldn't know how to approach without waking the household, wouldn't know which path to take without being seen, wouldn't risk a theft in a village with so little to steal. No, this was someone close, someone desperate, and yet no one knocked on doors. No accusations were made. The man didn't raise his voice or demand justice. He just went back inside, sat down, and ate a bowl of cold cabbage. There are rules in a village like this, spoken and unspoken. Theft is wrong, but hunger is worse. And when you've seen children crying from emptiness, when you've buried neighbors whose bellies held nothing, you start to understand that survival sometimes comes before morality. Still, the loss hurt. That pig meant meat for winter, meant grease for cooking, meant trade, perhaps, for cloth or salt. Its absence was a hole that couldn't be patched. Days passed. The family said nothing, but their eyes changed. They watched more closely, spoke less freely. The man began sleeping with his boots on. He repaired the pen even though he had nothing to put inside it. Meanwhile, the rest of the village moved with the same quiet guilt, a few extra kindlings left by their door, a bowl of broth offered and politely declined. No one admitted anything. That's how it worked. You stole. You lived. You didn't speak of it. And in time, the wound became another scar in the landscape of shared hardship. But things shifted after that. People started locking their storage sheds, tying their chickens in pairs. Not because they hated each other, but because trust frayed when bellies went empty, when survival demanded choices that left marks. And yet, even within the suspicion, there remained grace. During the spring thaw, a bundle of pork fat wrapped in linen was left on the man's doorstep. No note, no explanation, just something to render, to cook with, to remind him that he hadn't been forgotten. He took it inside without a word, shared it with his family, and never asked where it came from. That was the agreement. In times like these, you didn't seek justice. You sought balance, mercy in small doses, forgiveness in silence. The pig never returned, but life continued. And the village, with its quiet betrayals and even quieter acts of redemption, survived. Clean didn't mean what it means now. It didn't sparkle. It didn't smell like lavender or feel smooth to the touch. It simply meant not infected, not festering, not covered in flies. Peasants bathed as they could when water and privacy aligned, once a season, maybe twice. But cleanliness came in parts. A cloth dampened at the well, a quick rub behind the ears, a scraping of dirt from the soles of your feet with a stick. You learned to prioritize. The hands, always the hands. Then the face. Then whatever body part had been hurt, bruised, or cut. Washing was done without ceremony, and often without warmth. Rivers were cold, and buckets colder. Still, there was dignity in the effort. A woman might sit on a stool behind a curtain, rinsing her legs with rainwater saved in jars. A man might scrub his arms in the creek after slaughtering a pig, watching the blood swirl away downstream. The tools of cleanliness were few: rough cloth, ashes, sand, a dried herb or two to mask the scent. Soap, when it existed, stung the skin and left it raw. But it worked. And when it didn't, people turned to other remedies. Honey, garlic, onion poultices, spread over wounds, packed into cuts, bound with linen that had been boiled to softness. Children were taught early not to scratch insect bites or pick at scabs. Not because it was impolite, but because infection lurked behind every wound. They learned to fear the color red, not in fabric but in skin. The hot, angry swell around a splinter, the slow creep of heat up a leg from a blistered toe. There were no doctors, only wisdom. If it wept yellow, let it breathe. If it smelled sweet, cut it away. If it throbbed like a drum, pray. That was the rhythm of care. Not precise, not scientific, but rooted in observation and survival. Clean spaces were rare, but people kept things in order. Clay pots were scrubbed with rushes, spoons wiped and dried by the fire. Straw bedding changed when the lice grew too bold. And even when illness struck, the sick were kept separate, not out of fear, but out of respect. A clean rag folded over a forehead, a basin rinsed 3 times and dried in sunlight. They did what they could. And when death came anyway, they cleaned the body again, washed it from scalp to toe, dressed it in its best, not because they believed it mattered in some holy sense, but because it mattered to them, to leave the world looking human, to leave behind a memory that didn't smell of rot. Cleanliness wasn't comfort, it wasn't beauty, it was protection, ritual, care. And in a world that so often took without asking, it was one of the few things people still had control over. Even when everything else fell apart, they could still light a fire, heat a pot, and wipe the day's dirt from their hands. And sometimes, that was enough to feel human again. It started with a rash, just a red patch behind the boy's ear. His mother noticed it while brushing straw from his hair, but she said nothing at first. Children were always scratching, always bumping and bruising. Then it spread, across his neck, down his back, blistering in places. The village midwife said it was heat. The herb wife said it was the pox. The priest said nothing, just pressed across to the boy's forehead and moved on. By the end of the week, 3 more children had it, then an old man, then a woman who had never been sick a day in her life. And still, no one called it plague. Not yet. You didn't name the wolf until it was at your door. The sickness itched, burned, twisted the skin into strange shapes. Some recovered, others didn't. The ones who died did so quickly, quietly, wrapped in linen and buried at dusk. No bell, no procession, just soft footsteps and earth. The others were marked. Their skin healed, but not cleanly. Scars bloomed like spilled wax, on cheeks, arms, chests. The village began to look different. Faces turned away from each other more often. Eyes dropped. Children sat farther apart. The air seemed thicker, and though no law was spoken, people stopped visiting each other's homes. Food was left on thresholds. Prayers were said across fences. The church emptied, not from disbelief, but from distance. Even God, it seemed, could wait until the rash passed. But worse than the sickness was the change that followed. Once healed, the marked were watched. Not with cruelty, but with caution. The boy whose rash began it all returned to playing in the dust, but fewer children joined him. The woman with scars on her hands was handed things instead of touched. It wasn't exile. It was something softer. A quiet space that opened up around them and never quite closed. People didn't mean harm. They were afraid. In a world where disease could vanish and return in the same breath, the memory of illness clung harder than the illness itself. Still, life went on. The sun still rose. The bread still baked. The fields still needed tending. But something had shifted, the way a door shifts after too many storms. It still works, but it never closes quite the same. The boy grew older. His scar faded but never disappeared. He learned to be helpful, quiet, useful. People liked him for it, but they still flinched, slightly, when his sleeve rode up. The sickness was gone, but it hadn't left. Not really. It had sewn itself into the stories, the glances, the way people hesitated before touching a shared cup. And that was the true cost. Not just the fever, not just the grave, but the silence afterward. The unspoken division between the untouched and the marked. A quiet, lingering fear of skin that once blistered. And in a world built on closeness, of shared tools, shared meals, shared breath, that kind of distance could ache deeper than any wound. It was always loudest just after midnight. The baby's cough, wet and ragged, echoed through the tiny house like a bell tolling too early. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The mother had barely slept in 3 nights. Each time she closed her eyes, the sound yanked her back. A sharp breath, a wheeze, silence, then the desperate start of another round. She sat upright on the straw mattress, cradling the child against her chest, trying to share her warmth, her breath, her strength. The father stirred, eyes hollow, already reaching for the kettle. Water boiled over stones heated in the fire's last embers. The older children turned in their sleep but didn't wake. They'd learned not to. Illness was no stranger in this house. It had come before. It would come again. But this night felt different. The baby was too quiet between coughs, his limbs too limp. The mother whispered a prayer, half remembered, half made up, and kissed the damp curls clinging to his forehead. There was no doctor, no medicine beyond the wild mint crushed into a cloth and held beneath his nose, the broth barely swallowed between wheezing breaths. The midwife had come earlier in the week, offered all she could, a tincture, a blessing, advice to wait and hope. But hope ran thin when the baby wouldn't cry. That sound, so often dreaded in the first months, now felt like the only proof he was still trying. The father sat beside them, silent, his hands wrapped around the hot kettle, not for comfort, but for something to do. He couldn't fix this. And that helplessness was louder than the coughing. It filled the room, settled in the space between breaths. Outside, the wind moaned through the gaps in the shutters. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, an owl called out once and was gone. Inside, the baby struggled again, fighting for breath, for place, for life. And the mother rocked him, not with rhythm, but with instinct, as if motion itself could hold him here. Then, after what felt like hours stretched thin by fear, the cough slowed, not stopped, just softened. The breathing evened. The child, still fevered, finally slept. The silence returned, thick and uneasy, but better than the stillness they'd feared. The parents didn't speak. They just looked at each other across the small space, each holding part of the night's terror, too tired for words. Later, when the baby woke with a cry that rang sharp and clear, the mother smiled for the first time in days. The father laughed once, short, broken, relieved. Outside, dawn was rising, pale and slow, and though the fear hadn't left, it had shifted, become something smaller, survivable. Sleep returned in pieces, stolen between chores and other children needing tending, but that night remained lodged in memory, sharp and tender. Not because the baby had been sick, but because he had stayed. And in a world where not everyone did, that made all the difference. Feasts were rare and joy rarer still, but when both came together, they were unforgettable. It was the end of harvest, the fields finally cleared, and for once the barn held more than just hope. Barley in sacks, turnips in baskets, a pair of chickens plucked and ready, even a small wheel of cheese, aged enough to crumble with pride. The villagers gathered as they always did, shoulder to shoulder, boots muddy, cheeks red from the cold. A fire was lit in the common space, bigger than usual. Tables, just boards on barrels, were covered with cloths that hadn't seen use in a year. Someone strung dried flowers across the beams. There was singing, soft at first, then louder with each cup of ale. The food was passed in wide bowls, hands eager but not greedy. People laughed with full mouths, shouted across the firelight, told the same stories they always told. For a few hours, it felt like the world had given something back. But underneath the joy was something quieter. The empty chairs, the names not spoken, the dishes cooked with memory instead of ingredients. You could feel it when the laughter fell short, when a song ended and no one picked up the next verse. One woman stood holding a child that wasn't hers. One man wore a scarf that had once belonged to his brother. The feast wasn't a celebration, it was a reckoning. A way to mark the fact that they had survived something, even if not everyone had. The priest offered a blessing that mentioned no specific names, but carried all of them just the same. He didn't ask for bounty. He asked for enough, for warmth, for the continued rising of the sun, and for the grace to keep each other standing. There was no dancing, but some swayed to the beat of a drum made from a stretched pigskin, played by a boy too young to remember why they used to dance more often. The ale flowed until it didn't, until the barrels gave only hollow echoes. Plates were licked clean, bones cracked and sucked dry. By the end, only the fire remained, flickering like the last candle in a church no one had the strength to rebuild. People lingered, not because they were still hungry, but because returning to their homes meant returning to the quiet again, to the long nights and the empty corners. Eventually, they parted with nods and murmured thanks. No grand goodbyes, just the shuffle of boots and the soft closing of doors. The feast would be remembered not for the food, but for the feeling that for one evening, no one was alone, that the village had drawn close enough to carry its sorrow together, that survival wasn't just toil, but occasionally it was this: a shared loaf, a warm bowl, a story told twice just for the comfort of hearing it again. And though they'd wake hungry tomorrow, tonight they'd gone to sleep full of something better than food, something like belonging. The miller's eyes were always watching, even when his mouth was smiling. His stone tower stood apart from the village, just close enough to remind everyone of his importance, just far enough to make him feel untouchable. The mill wasn't just a building, it was a gate, and he was the one who held the key. No grain became bread without passing through his hands. The wheel turned steadily, creaking like an old throat clearing itself, powered by the slow, stubborn river that never rushed, only trudged along its muddy path. Villagers brought their sacks in silence, lined up like penitents, hoping their measure would return full. But it never did. A handful missing here, a pinch there. Not enough to accuse, just enough to notice. No one spoke of it openly. You didn't accuse the man who could ruin your winter with a shrug. Besides, he was polite, kind even. He asked after your children, complimented your flour, offered ale if the wait ran long. But his scales never quite balanced. And everyone knew. It wasn't theft. Not in the eyes of the steward, who had long ago given the miller his license, his protection. It was business. That's what the miller called it. And still, the villagers came, because they had no choice. The hand quern was slow, too hard on old backs, too dull to do more than make dust and sweat. So they brought their grain to the wheel and accepted the loss like they accepted so much else. Some whispered that the miller stored the extra in a hidden cellar, that he sold it to merchants on the road, or offered it to the steward in exchange for favors. No one ever found proof, and even if they had, what could be done? The mill was necessary, and necessary things are often forgiven more than they deserve. But once, one winter, the wheel stopped turning. Ice locked the river. The building fell silent, and so did the miller. No flour, no bread. Just a building with a door shut tight and smoke curling from its chimney while the village starved. It lasted 2 weeks. Then the thaw came, and with it, the sound of stone grinding grain returned, but something had changed. The villagers looked at the miller differently now, not with anger exactly, but with clarity. They saw the line between cooperation and control, between service and quiet cruelty. And while they still brought their grain, they also began sharpening their querns again, teaching their children how to grind, slowly, by hand, under candlelight, just in case. The miller never spoke of the winter. He returned to his pleasant nods and careful weighing. But now the smiles were thinner. And the people, hungrier but wiser, watched his hands a little more closely. In that balance of flour and silence, something shifted. Power is quiet in villages like these. It lives in routines, in grudges, in the way a scale tips just slightly too far to one side. But it's not invisible. And once you've seen it, you don't unsee it again. The hearth was always burning, but tonight the smell was different. Not the usual scent of barley stew or boiled cabbage. This was sharper, meat and smoke mingling in a way that made the whole room feel heavier. A pig had been slaughtered earlier that morning, and every part of it was being used. Not because of thrift, though thrift was sacred here, but because it had to be. The winter had been long, the stores were low, and the village needed something more than dried roots and grain dust. The carcass had been divided carefully, the choice cuts salted, the bones set aside for broth, the offal stewed over low flame until tender enough to forget what it was. The pot hung over the fire, bubbling slowly, filling the air with a richness that made mouths water even before the first spoonful was served. It was a feast, yes, but not of celebration, of necessity. Smoke rose in pale ribbons toward the thatch, thick with the scent of rendered fat and ash. Children hovered near the pot, eyes wide, stomachs loud. The older ones waited their turn in silence, knowing better than to rush. Everyone knew what meat meant. It meant strength for the sick, warmth for the bones, a memory to carry through the next lean stretch. The room was close with bodies, with hunger, with a quiet reverence that only came when food was more than food. It was survival. There was no laughter, not this time, just the soft sound of chewing, the scrape of wooden spoons, the occasional murmur of thanks that no one directed anywhere in particular. A woman tore bread and dipped it into the broth, then handed it to her mother without meeting her eyes. A child tried to hide a second helping beneath his tunic, but was caught and forgiven. Even guilt tasted better than hunger. The fat crackled as it cooled in the pan, poured carefully into jars to be used later. Nothing wasted. Even the skin would be dried, the bones cracked open for their marrow, the blood turned to pudding if there was enough left. These weren't meals, they were equations, calculated to stretch over days, to fill as many mouths as possible, to leave nothing behind. And later, when the pot was scraped clean and the bowls rinsed with boiled water, the smoke still clung. To clothes, to hair, to the walls. It lingered like a memory, a sign that something had been given up so others could last a little longer. Meat was rare, not because the animals were few, but because they mattered more alive than dead. Killing one was a choice not easily made. But tonight, that choice had fed 20 people, and the fire, fed with bones and scraps, burned a little brighter. Not in joy, but in gratitude. For another day, another night, another belly that wouldn't wake hollow. And in that warmth, in that smoke, life held on. They said the forest had teeth, not in the way of fairy tales, with wolves and witches and trees that whispered names, but in the way that it took things and didn't give them back. It stood at the edge of the village like a warning, dense and dark, where the paths vanished if you walked too far or too fast. Most people didn't go in unless they had to, and when they did, they left markers, tied bits of cloth to branches, scratched symbols into bark, dropped stones every few yards to find their way out again. It wasn't superstition, it was experience. The forest swallowed sound. You could walk 50 paces in and hear nothing but your own breath and the occasional rustle that made your heart beat twice as fast. That's where the boy had gone. No one saw him leave, but by dusk his absence was loud. His mother shouted first, then his brother. Then the whole village joined in. They lit torches and called his name. Tomas. Tomas. But the forest, as always, gave no reply. Just wind through the high branches and the distant creak of trees leaning on one another like tired men. They searched for hours, followed footprints until they faded into moss and root, found a patch of turned leaves, a snapped twig, and nothing else. By midnight, most had returned. Not from lack of love, but from fear. They knew the signs. The forest didn't take things gently. If you weren't back by nightfall, you weren't meant to come back at all. Still, his father remained, standing near the old elm, eyes fixed on a path that wasn't really a path anymore, just a narrow break between brambles where a child might squeeze through. He stayed until dawn, until the mist lifted and the birds began to sing again. But Tomas never returned. In the days that followed, no one said the word lost. They just talked around it, said things like, he wandered too far, or he's probably with the saints now. His mother kept his shoes by the fire for a month. His sister never played near the woods again. And every so often, someone claimed to hear footsteps near the trees after dark. A boy's voice, maybe, or just the wind. Either way, the village shifted its borders, moved the fences back a little, stopped gathering firewood past a certain point. They didn't speak of it directly, but when they prayed, they added an extra line: protect us from the forest. Not because it was evil, but because it didn't care. It didn't choose. It just waited. And sometimes when life grew too thin, when food ran too low, or when curiosity overcame caution, it opened its arms and did what wild things do. It kept what it was given. And in return, it taught the rest to stay close, to stay seen, to stay wary of places that didn't speak back. Rot wasn't always a warning. Sometimes it was a beginning. In the corner of the yard, behind the animal pens, a low pit had been dug, a compost heap, though no one called it that. Just a place for peelings, broken stalks, sour milk, and whatever couldn't be fed to pigs or chickens. In the heat of summer, it steamed. In winter, it froze in place like a half-digested thought. Flies loved it. So did dogs, when no one was looking. But beneath the stench and slime was something sacred: transformation. Decay, done properly, gave life. The villagers understood this in a way that didn't require teaching. They saw it in the way last year's cabbage leaves returned as this year's fat carrots, in the way bones blackened from the hearth fed the same soil they once rose from. They turned their waste into layers, ash and straw, rot and rest, stirred with sticks or bare hands if necessary. It wasn't pleasant work, but it was necessary, and that gave it dignity. A child might be told to carry a pail of scraps to the pile, not as punishment, but as a rite of learning. Put it where the new things grow, a mother might say. And so the child would pour old stew, or crushed eggshells, or moldy bread onto the mound, watching it sink into the mess of it all. Nothing was wasted, not even the waste, especially not the waste. In a world with so little, the idea that rot had value was a comfort, proof that even the spoiled could serve. Even the ruined had a use. The smell never quite left the yard, clinging to the backs of houses like a damp coat, but no one complained. They'd rather smell compost than hunger. And when the planting season came again, the heap was gold. Turned over with shovels and carried to the fields in sacks patched a dozen times, it became the earth's memory of what had come before. The women spread it along the rows with care, mixing it into soil dry from frost and old prayer. The men didn't speak while they worked, just grunted, nodded, moved. The children stayed back, watching, learning. And when the first sprouts pushed through a few weeks later, no one said aloud what they all knew. The green was born of rot. And that was good. That was the way of things. Life built from death, fresh from foul. The stink of yesterday becoming the breath of tomorrow. In those moments, no one needed saints or sermons, just a shovel, a patch of sun, and the trust that something ugly could bloom again. The pile at the back of the yard never shrank, but neither did the hope it fed. It stood there, steaming in the morning chill, a quiet engine of survival. And everyone, from the oldest elder to the newest child, knew this truth without question. Nothing truly ends. It just changes form, And sometimes that change saves you. A coin didn't just jingle, it echoed. In a village where most trade was done by barter, where value was measured in eggs, wool, or hours of labor, a single silver penny could change the temperature of a room. It was rare to see one, rarer still to hold one. Most peasants went their whole lives without the weight of minted metal in their palms. When a coin did appear, paid for labor outside the village, dropped by a passing merchant, gifted by a generous steward, it was handled like fire, carefully, and with quiet awe. The edges were smooth from passing through too many hands, the stamp faded, but still recognizable. A king's profile, maybe, or a cross pressed into the soft face of silver. It was wealth, but more than that, it was possibility. A coin could buy salt, or cloth, or soap from the peddler who came once a season with a crooked cart and tales of towns that smelled of fresh bread and torchlight. But coins also attracted notice. If you had one, people knew, not always because you told them, but because word traveled like smoke. And once they knew, things changed. Requests appeared. Debts were remembered. That bit of meat you were lent last winter suddenly came with a cost. A coin was power, and power was never invisible. Some hid theirs, buried in a jar beneath the hearth, or stitched into the lining of a coat. Others spent quickly, before the weight of it twisted into obligation. A boy once bought a knife with his, not a fancy one, just sturdy, well-balanced, sharp. He used it for years, became known for how cleanly he dressed rabbits, how quickly he whittled fence posts. That one coin changed his name in the village, from child to useful. But others weren't so lucky. A woman traded hers for a bolt of dyed cloth, intending to make a cloak for her daughter's wedding. The cloth was stolen a week later. The thief was never found, and the daughter married in a borrowed shawl. The coin had vanished, and with it, the dream it carried. The steward demanded coins, of course, for taxes, for permissions, for the mill. Even when he accepted grain or labor instead, the price in silver hung in the air like a second, invisible debt. Most resented the idea of it, a thing made far away by hands they'd never shake, stamped with faces they'd never meet. But they also understood its power. A coin was freedom, in the thinnest, briefest sense. It let you say no when otherwise you'd have to nod. It let you choose, even once. And in a life built on routines carved by others, that was a kind of miracle. So when one passed from hand to hand, it was done with care, not reverence, but understanding. This small, cold circle could feed a family, or ruin one, and everyone who held it, even for a breath, felt the weight of what it promised, and what it could take. The wind had a habit of remembering things no one else did. It moved through the village like a restless guest, dragging scents and memories from door to door. Ashes from last week's fire, the sour tang of compost, the dry crackle of a distant field burned too early. But on certain nights, especially after the harvest was taken in and the trees stood bare as bone, the wind carried voices. Not loud, just murmurs, stories, warnings, echoes of things that once mattered. The villagers didn't talk much about it, but they noticed. They'd draw their cloaks tighter, add another log to the fire, and sleep a little closer to each other. Because the wind, while not evil, wasn't entirely safe either. It brought illness sometimes. There was a phrase for it, fever on the wind. When people fell sick in clusters with no explanation, some blamed water, others blamed bad humors, but many just looked at the sky and said, "The wind turned foul." It wasn't scientific, but it wasn't foolish. There was a pattern. Cold gusts sweeping down from the hills that arrived days before a cough spread like spilled ink. A strange stillness before the children's cheeks grew too hot and their voices too quiet. The wise women, those who kept herbs drying in their rafters and prayers in their pockets, would sometimes leave offerings, burnt rosemary, hung charms, whispered songs, as if bargaining with something unseen. And when the wind shifted back, when the air felt neutral again, they'd nod without relief. Survival didn't come with celebration. It came with restraint, with humility. When someone died, the wind carried that too. The smell of the candles, the heavy oil used to wash the body, the silence of a village that dared not speak ill of the recently departed. It would stir the corners of cloaks and lift the hair of those standing at the burial mound, reminding everyone that nothing stayed still for long. The wind didn't care who lived or died. It moved through everyone. Even the animals reacted, cows growing restless, dogs howling at nothing in particular. It was hard to tell whether it was superstition or something deeper, something ancient, older than the village, older than memory. At night, it seeped through the wattle walls and under the door, brushing cold fingers across ankles, whispering through the rafters. And you, lying there with a blanket over your head and a sibling's elbow in your ribs, would wonder what it wanted, or if it wanted anything at all. Maybe it just listened, or reminded, or remembered for you. In a world with so little permanence, where names faded and homes collapsed and food vanished into mouths and mud, the wind was eternal. The same breath that rattled your shutters had stirred the leaves when your great-grandmother was born, and it would still be moving long after your name was forgotten. It wasn't your enemy, but it wasn't your friend either. It was just there. And that sometimes was more terrifying than anything else. There was a certain kind of silence that followed childbirth, deep, heavy, and not always joyful. In the dim light of a cottage's single room, surrounded by sweat-soaked straw and the smell of iron and blood, a woman either survived or didn't. And when she did, no one cheered. They whispered thanks. They dipped rags into warm water, wrapped blankets tighter, and pressed small cups of thin ale or broth into her shaking hands. A new life had entered the world, but it came through a door that swung both ways. Birth was the most common miracle and the most frequent death sentence. There were no doctors, just midwives, often older women who had seen too much and promised too little. Their hands were calloused, their eyes sharp, their minds filled with knowledge passed from mother to daughter, not written down, only remembered. They knew how to reposition a breeched child by feel alone, how to ease pain with mugwort and willow bark, how to recognize when a woman was slipping too far to follow. And they also knew how to stay quiet, because in those moments hope was delicate, like a flame in a storm. Some births ended in silence, the baby never crying. Others ended with screams that didn't stop until the night crept in. And occasionally, rarely, there was laughter. A strong child, a surviving mother, a family doubled in size and still whole. But even then, no one relaxed. The danger wasn't over. Fever could come days later, creeping through the womb like a thief. Bleeding could return in the night. The baby might fail to feed, or simply stop breathing. There was no certainty, only a sequence of fragile hopes. Survive the labor, survive the week, survive the winter. Baptism was urgent, not for celebration, but for protection. If a priest could be summoned in time, the child would be named with cold water and quick prayers. If not, the midwife might do it herself, whispering Latin she barely understood, just in case. Better a soul claimed early than lost entirely. The mother rested as best she could, though rest was never long. Within days, she was expected to rise, to help, to cook, to work. Pain was not a reason to stop. Only death was. Still, the birth of a child was not just a risk. It was resistance. It was planting a flag in a world that tried, every season, to erase you. Children meant continuity, a promise that someone would still be tending the hearth when your own hands grew too tired. But even so, no one planned too far ahead. They didn't ask, "What will he become?" They asked, "Will he last the month?" And if he did, only then would they dream further. A carved spoon, a stitched blanket, a whispered story to lull him into sleep. These were the hopes of peasant life, small, quiet, necessary, carried in a baby's breath, and guarded like a treasure far more valuable than coin or land. The well was the village's throat. Everything passed through it: need, rumor, disease. It stood at the center, framed by worn stones and a wooden cover that creaked in protest whenever lifted. No one owned it, but everyone relied on it. Mornings began there. Women in layers of wool, shawls draped like smoke around their shoulders, walked with clay jugs and wooden buckets swinging from ropes. Children came behind, sometimes helping, sometimes trailing off to chase chickens or listen at corners. The water was deep and often cold, with a silty taste that clung to the tongue. No one questioned it. It was simply what water was. You didn't expect sweetness or clarity, just wetness and enough of it to boil grain, quench thirst, and wash what needed washing. But wells were also vulnerable. A sickness could spread from the bucket as easily as from breath. If someone died too suddenly, too strangely, the midwife might mutter about the well. A frog fished up in a pail was a bad sign. A smell like rot? Worse. Superstition and practicality blurred together when survival was on the line. A foul well could doom a village, slowly and without fanfare. So it was watched, maintained. If a bird drowned in it, the water might be refused for days. If mold clung to the edges, someone would fetch lime, if they could afford it, or herbs thought to cleanse the spirit as much as the sickness. No one truly knew what made water clean. They just knew how quickly it could become a weapon. So caution became tradition. Prayers were whispered before drawing it. Some spat into the bucket for luck. Others left offerings: garlic, salt, a sliver of bread, on the stones when the seasons changed. And still, every so often, the water betrayed them. A rash of illness, bellies swelling, fevers burning through families like brush fire. Then came the blame. Had someone offended the saints? Was it a punishment? A curse? Was the forest angry or the ground unquiet? In those moments, the well became a mirror, reflecting the village's fears back at them. Arguments broke out. Elders remembered old rites. Stories resurfaced of a child once drowned, or a witch's curse muttered long ago. But eventually, the fear settled. Buckets were hauled again. The water still tasted like silt. And life went on, because it had to. There was no river nearby, no spring on the hill. The well was all they had. And so it was feared, respected, used. A paradox of trust and terror, essential and potentially lethal. When things were good, it was taken for granted. When they turned bad, it was the first suspect. But it remained. That worn circle of stone and rope, humming faintly in the silence, as if remembering every hand that had reached into it, every face that peered down and wondered what might be staring back. The well gave. Sometimes it took, but it never stopped. And neither did the people who gathered around it, day after cautious day. Before the first frost, before the wind turned bitter and the sun sank too early, there was one ritual that every household performed with quiet determination: preserving. Not in grand barrels or glass jars lined on wooden shelves, that belonged to stories of wealthy kitchens. No, for the average peasant, preservation was a desperate kind of accounting, a mental tally of what might last through winter and what would rot before December. Cabbages were buried in pits or cellars, wrapped in straw and stored like treasure. Beans and peas were dried on flat stones, turned daily until their skin cracked like old bark. Salted meat, if you had any, hung high in the rafters, usually pork, cured over smoky fires with layers of coarse salt that turned fingertips dry and raw. But more often than not, there wasn't meat. There were roots, turnips, onions, carrots the color of ash and clay. These were not delicacies. They were the last defense against hunger. Everything was precious. Apple slices, strung like garlands to dry in the sun, leeks braided and hung like charms, herbs wrapped tight and stashed near the hearth. Even the crumbs had a purpose. Bread gone stale wasn't thrown away. It was soaked, stewed, or crumbled into pottage. Spoilage was an enemy, creeping in with mold, soft spots, or the rustle of mice. And so every night someone checked the stores, not always with hope, but always with duty. A shriveled apple could be the difference between enduring and weakening. Dried nettles were saved for tea, not comfort but medicine, bitter and sharp on the tongue, but said to cleanse the blood. Fat was rendered and saved in pottery jars, used to cook, to make candles, even to rub on cracked skin. Nothing was wasted. Nothing. In hard years, people boiled bark, chewed on shoe leather softened by broth. Soup became more water than substance, and even that was shared. A pot of pottage might sit on the hearth for days, constantly added to and never emptied, each dip of the ladle bringing a different flavor, a different memory. A stranger might see it as filth. The villagers saw it as resilience. Winter didn't just arrive, it loomed. And every bite taken now was calculated. Could it last? Could you? Children were taught this rhythm before they could walk. They watched as their mothers turned roots in their hands like coins, deciding whether they were too soft to keep or too precious to lose. Fathers counted what hung in the rafters, fingers twitching with memory, not greed. Preservation wasn't a chore. It was survival in layers, stacked, tied, salted, hidden. A season stored in shadows and smoke. And when the snow came, when the land went silent and the animals huddled in stalls, the preserved became the only taste of color left in a white world. Every meal was a memory of summer, a victory against decay, a whisper of green in the cold, and each one meant another day endured. There was something sacred about the act of mending. Not just clothes, but everything. A cracked pot, a broken fence rail, a torn bit of linen that had already outlived 2 infants and now served as bandage, dishcloth, or swaddling once again. In the world of peasants, where coin was scarce and replacement was a fantasy, repair was the only kind of wealth most people ever knew. Mothers stitched sleeves by firelight with fingers stiff from cold, not for craft, but for necessity. Every patch told a story, this tear from the harvest scythe, that stain from a spilled broth pot, another rip from a bramble in the forest path. Clothes were not expressions of self. They were extensions of skin, reused, layered, passed down until the fabric itself began to vanish. A tunic might begin life on a father's back and end as a child's pillow cover, with dozens of iterations in between. Thread was precious, kept in small bone tubes or tucked in wooden boxes lined with straw. Needles were treasures. If one broke, it was mourned. Repaired seams weren't hidden. They were displayed like scars, proof that something had lived longer than it should have. Even tools were mended, handles rewrapped in twine, iron blades resharpened until they were half their original width. Everything worked until it didn't, and even then, it was often reimagined into something new. Worn shoes became insoles. A cracked mug became a seed pot. The idea of throwing something away was absurd. It simply changed form. Repair wasn't seen as failure. It was evidence of care, of attention, of time. You mended things you loved or needed, or more often, both. A grandmother might sit with her granddaughter, teaching her how to tighten the stitches on a woolen cap, not because it was charming, but because cold could kill, and every gap in the weave was a danger. The act was slow, repetitive, and oddly calming, like prayer, a kind of defiance too, saying to the world, "You may break, but I will not discard." Even relationships were mended this way. Disputes were patched with bread and apologies. Neighbors repaired fences together after arguments left them leaning. Life in the village required this kind of humility, an understanding that damage wasn't the end, just a new shape of the same thing. People grew up knowing that everything they touched would eventually fray or crack. And when it did, the answer wasn't despair. It was a needle, or a nail, or a bit of straw and patience. This was the rhythm of survival, not in grand gestures, but in the steady, persistent refusal to let things fall apart. And so the world held together not through abundance, but through the quiet strength of hands that refused to give up. Even in their own bodies, peasants learned to mend, limping instead of resting, binding a swollen knee with wool, living through the ache. Mending wasn't a choice. It was the art of staying, staying warm, staying clothed, staying alive. The fire never truly went out. Even in sleep, it smoldered low in the hearth, fed by scraps of wood, dry moss, and whatever could be spared. It wasn't just warmth, it was life. Without it, water didn't boil, food didn't cook, and frost crept in faster than prayers. In the long, dark months, when the nights stretched longer than memory and the cold pressed through the walls like a ghost, the fire became the village's quiet guardian. Children were taught early how to feed it, gently, with respect, never wastefully. A single spark, once lost, might mean hours of coaxing from flint and steel, or a shameful walk to a neighbor's home to beg for embers in a clay jar. No one mocked that request. Everyone knew the cost of a cold hearth. Ashes were never thrown out carelessly. They were sifted for heat, for luck, sometimes even for soap making, or scattered in the garden to ward off pests. The fireplace itself was humble, just a stone-lined pit or a raised mound of packed earth, with a hole above for smoke to escape. Sometimes the room still filled with haze, especially in winter, when wet wood hissed instead of burned. Eyes watered, lungs ached, but no one complained. That smoke meant survival. Meals were stretched over its glow, pottage stirred and reheated, roots roasted slowly, the occasional strip of meat crackling on a spit. But the fire also brought people together. The room revolved around it. Work was done beside it. Stories were told by its flickering edge. It was where people sat to warm their backs and dry their socks, where infants were rocked and wounds were cleaned. The fire was not just heat, it was presence. On bitter nights, people slept close to it, their feet curled toward the warmth, ears tuned to the snap of kindling and the distant howl of wind beyond the door. The crackle was a lullaby. Without it, silence became dangerous. Cold invited sickness. It stiffened fingers, split lips, and made even waking feel like a chore. So keeping the fire lit was a quiet duty, passed from hand to hand. Someone always checked it before bed. Someone rose early to feed it. Its health was everyone's concern. In many homes, the fire had a name or was spoken to like a friend. "Stay with us," they'd whisper, "just until morning." And sometimes that was enough, because in the middle of winter, when the sky gave nothing and the earth slept hard and unyielding. A fire was more than flame. It was resistance. It was the soft rebellion of warmth in a world determined to be cold. And when the fire flared high, just once, in celebration or accident, the entire room brightened, not just with light, but with a brief glimpse of something bigger. A reminder that life, though fragile, could still burn fiercely. And as long as that fire burned, even low, there was still time, still breath, still another day. The body knew things before the mind did. It ached before the storm. It shivered before the wind picked up. It warned of illness long before the fever arrived. For a medieval peasant, the body wasn't just flesh. It was a weathered tool, a gauge, a warning bell. There were no doctors, no diagnoses, no mirrors. You learned your health by feel, by the way your hands trembled while chopping wood, or the dull throb behind your eyes that didn't lift with sleep. Pain was constant, but not remarked upon. A sore back was simply proof you'd done your part. Cracked heels and blistered fingers were a badge of usefulness. The concept of health wasn't about thriving. It was about enduring. Sickness, however, brought silence, a stillness to the home that everyone noticed. When someone didn't rise with the dawn, the air around them changed. They lay curled beneath rough wool blankets, flushed or pale, whispering in their sleep, or not speaking at all. The fire burned lower that day. Meals went simpler. The rhythm shifted. Healing, if it happened, was done with layers. Hot compresses of boiled herbs, whispered prayers, the gentle hands of a neighbor or mother wiping sweat from a brow. Sometimes the wise woman came, with her pouches and poultices, her knowledge passed down not from books, but from mothers and midwives. She knew how to draw out fevers with willow bark or break a cough with garlic and honey, though neither was guaranteed. No one expected miracles. They expected time, rest, luck, and faith above all. Illnesses weren't explained. They were endured. Bad air, bad humors, or divine punishment were all equally accepted. Maybe you had worked too hard. Maybe the saints were displeased. Maybe someone had spoken against you under their breath. And so you carried charms, hung herbs above the door, avoided certain paths at dusk. You watched your breath for signs, the way it steamed in the cold or caught in your chest. You listened to the sound of your own cough, whether it rattled or lingered. And you hoped, because healing wasn't about treatment, it was about waiting long enough to see if your body would return to you. And when it did, if it did, you didn't celebrate. You rose slowly, leaned against the wall for support, and rejoined life as though nothing had happened. Because sickness was a guest that came often, uninvited, and might return tomorrow. You didn't tempt it by speaking its name. You just moved forward as you always had, wearing your body like old armor. Dented, tired, but still yours. Still standing. That alone was reason enough to keep going. Because in a world with no medicine and few answers, every step taken after sickness was its own quiet victory. There was no calendar nailed to the wall, no clean squares with numbers to count down the days. Time was something you felt in your bones and read in the fields. You knew it not by precision, but by rhythm, the way the sun moved across the room, the slow return of green to the trees, the way your fingers cracked deeper as the frost set in. A peasant's life was marked by cycles, not events. Days were tied to work, and seasons were tied to survival. Spring meant planting, and the aching hope that the ground wouldn't betray you again. Summer meant sweat and endless labor, hauling water and pulling weeds. Autumn meant gathering, every apple, every root, every crumb, because winter would take more than you ever gave. And winter was a test, of patience, of planning, of strength. Each season brought its own tempo, and you learned to move with it, not against it. Time wasn't something you could save or spend. It was simply the space between sunrise and sunset, between one task and the next. Church bells, if you were close enough to hear them, gave a kind of structure, but even those were muffled by wind or distance. Instead, you learned to measure days by the wear on your boots or the fading in your clothes. You remembered years by what they brought: the year the barley failed, the spring of the late snow, the time old Elsie's cow gave birth to twins. Memory was seasonal too, and it was rarely about your own milestones. Birthdays weren't celebrated, not the way they are now. Most people didn't even know the exact day they were born. Age was an estimate, marked by the harvest you helped with, the deaths you witnessed, the famines you endured. If someone asked how old you were, you'd probably shrug and say, "Old enough to know better," or "younger than the priest, older than the mill boy." No one kept track because the land didn't care how many years you'd walked it. Time didn't honor you, it challenged you. And you responded not with ceremony, but with habit. The first frost meant storing cabbage. The lengthening days meant watching the sheep more closely. Rain in March meant a nervous glance at the seed sacks. You didn't need numbers to understand what came next. Your body told you. The land told you. The quiet between chores told you. And as the years layered on top of each other like worn blankets, you carried them not in journals or etched stone, but in the curve of your spine, the lines on your hands, the moments you paused and remembered something that had no date but lived in you still. In this world, time wasn't something that passed. It was something you walked through, slow and steady, until it became a part of you. And that was enough. In a world with no locks and few secrets, privacy was a concept most peasants never entertained. Life was shared: space, work, sorrow, joy, even silence. A single-room home meant you slept, ate, wept, and healed in the same square of earth and timber, surrounded by the same breath and body heat of family, neighbors, and livestock. There was no door to close on your pain, no corner to retreat to when words stung or grief arrived. You learned instead how to live beside others, how to blend your routines like braided rope, tight and dependent. Children were born into arms that already held cousins, aunts, elders, and goats. You could not afford the distance, nor did the world make room for it. There was always a shoulder brushing yours, a shared cup, a murmured prayer beside your own. And yet, within that closeness, people carved out slivers of solitude in unexpected ways. A moment spent drawing patterns in the soot on the hearthstone. A walk to the well, taken a little slower than usual. A gaze fixed too long on the sky while pretending to check the weather. Privacy became an internal place, something you carried inside, like a folded note kept hidden beneath your tunic. You learned to keep thoughts quiet, to speak only when the words mattered, to nod instead of ask, and to find stillness in repetition. It wasn't repression, it was survival. Because when space was scarce, emotion had to be economical. Arguments were brief and forgotten by sundown. Tears were wiped quickly unless they were shared by many. There were no long confessions, no outbursts, no solitude to indulge them in. You made peace with the noise, the breathing, the crying infant, the cousin with a cough, the creaking roof, the lowing cow beside your bed. Sound was life. Stillness could be dangerous. You learned to speak in glances, in gestures, in routines. Everyone knew when someone was grieving without asking. They would stir the stew without being told, mend the cloak without a word. And when the day finally gave way to night, the hush came not from peace, but from exhaustion. Blankets were shared. Body heat passed from one sleeper to another. Dreams mingled with the scent of smoke and sweat. You turned your back, not out of offense, but to face the wall and rest your mind. There was a strange comfort in that closeness. in knowing others were breathing beside you, that you were not alone in your waking or your worry. Even love, the quiet, hesitant kind, was born in these crowded spaces, not from grand declarations, but from routine kindness. A hand brushing yours at the table, a slice of bread saved for later, a whispered word before sleep. In the tight weave of shared existence, privacy became something else. Not separation, but understanding. The ability to hold your thoughts without needing to escape, and to know that even if nothing was just yours, everything was shared in a way that gave it meaning. In the quiet hours after dusk, when the fire had shrunk to embers and the day's work no longer pressed on shoulders, the stories began, not written down, not read aloud, simply spoken, woven from memory and rumor, from fragments of truth and imagination. This was the peasant's library, mouths that remembered, voices that carried, tales shaped by the teller and bent with each retelling. Stories weren't entertainment, they were inheritance. They held warnings, wisdom, laughter, and the comfort of repetition. Grandparents spoke of wolves with glowing eyes, saints who walked in dreams, neighbors who had once outrun the plague itself. Children listened with wide eyes, half in fear, half in hope that some part of it might be true. There were stories of fields that refused to grow, of bread that turned to ash, of weddings that happened in the snow, and always there was the past. Before the hard winter, someone would begin, and a hush would fall. Not because the story was new, but because it was known, and that made it safe. Stories held the names of those long buried, the details of harvests past, the quiet triumphs no steward ever recorded, and within them, you learned how to live. You learned not to plant too early, not to trust the man with a crooked smile, not to leave bread uncovered during a full moon. It wasn't superstition, it was tradition, laced with caution, shaped by generations. And when the wind howled, when illness crept from one cot to another, when bellies grumbled louder than prayers, the stories held fast. They were a kind of armor, not against death, but against forgetting. Because the world had no ledger for your life. No monument would be raised when you were gone. But if someone remembered your name in a story, even just once a year, then you had mattered. And so the tales were passed on. A mother would whisper one into her daughter's ear while braiding her hair. A father would mutter one beside his son while repairing a fence. Some were funny, others tragic, many unfinished. But they endured, even in famine, even in plague, especially then, because in those times, when there was little left to eat and less left to say, a story could feed the soul, could spark a smile, a tear, a glance toward the stars. There was power in saying, this happened before and we survived. There was comfort in knowing someone else had walked your path and made it through. In that way, storytelling was resistance, a refusal to disappear quietly, a promise that even if your hands were blistered and your name never written, your voice might still echo, around a fire, in a field, or in a child's dream. In a world that rarely offered permanence, stories were the closest thing to forever, and when the fire dimmed and the last words were spoken, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, with memory, with presence, with the faint heartbeat of the past still alive. The first frost didn't come with warning. It came in the night, soft and quiet, and left everything shimmering with a cold silver that burned your fingers by dawn. You'd step outside and see the garden hunched in on itself, leaves curled, stalks collapsed, the last of the summer's green turned brittle under your touch. And that's when the race began, the race against a season that took more than it gave. Winter wasn't a single event. It was a slow devourer, creeping in through cracks in the doorframe and silence at the dinner table. By the time it truly settled, the landscape had gone pale and mute. Birds vanished. Streams froze at the edges. The soil, once pliant and generous, turned hard and unfeeling. Inside, you rearranged your world to hold in what little warmth you could. Blankets layered thick with straw, animals brought indoors to share heat, every draft sealed with cloth or wishful thinking. Firewood became currency, not just fuel, but life measured in dry branches. You rationed it like food, each log placed carefully, each flame coaxed into being with patience and breath. The fire never stopped burning if you could help it. Its glow was your clock, your guardian, your only indulgence. The days grew short and gray, the kind of light that never fully arrived. You worked less, but worried more. Food stores shrank. You counted them obsessively. How many onions left, how much salted pork, how thin you could slice the bread. Hunger came slow, then fast. Your body adjusted in small ways, sleeping longer to conserve energy, skipping meals without admitting it, chewing slower to trick the stomach. Everyone did it. Children learned early to ask less. Even laughter, when it came, was quieter in winter, as if joy might draw the cold closer. You didn't speak of how hard it was. You just lived it. Feet near the fire, back to the wind, hands chapped and wrapped. Outside, the snow made everything seem peaceful, beautiful even. But beauty wasn't warmth. It didn't fill the pot or stop the ache in your knees. And still, there was a strange sort of closeness in winter, a nearness born from the struggle. Families pressed tighter, voices lowered, kindness took on new forms, offering the last bit of stew, patching someone's cloak, giving up the warmer side of the room. These were the acts that got remembered, not who complained or gave up, but who stayed, who endured, who helped. The cold made equals of everyone. No rank or wealth could fight it off forever. And when the worst of it finally broke, when a bird returned or a patch of earth turned soft again, you didn't celebrate with feasts. You simply exhaled. You stepped outside and noticed color returning to the world. A green shoot, a thawed path, the smell of wet earth instead of ice. And in that small moment, after months of silence, you remembered why people survived it all. Because spring came back, eventually. There was a quiet knowledge passed through generations, not in books, not in sermons, but in the way hands moved over soil, how someone watched the sky before planting, or chose to harvest a day early because of the way the wind shifted. This was the unspoken science of survival. Observation honed over centuries, woven into the daily rhythm like thread in a tunic. A peasant might not read, but they could read the land. They knew when the birds migrated early, it meant the cold would bite sooner. They knew that a certain kind of morning fog clung lower when rain was coming, that cows grew restless before storms. These signs weren't magic. They were memory, carried in gestures and murmured explanations. You learned not through theory, but repetition. You watched and you copied, and slowly you came to understand what the elders meant when they said, "Listen to the trees." In a world without forecasts or maps, your life depended on how well you could interpret the clues nature left behind. The soil itself was a teacher. You'd kneel and press your hand to it, feel its dampness, sift it between your fingers. If it clumped too tightly, you waited. If it crumbled, you planted. It was that simple and that profound. You didn't need a plow chart. You had your knees, your skin, your breath. And when the seasons betrayed you, when frost came too soon, or rain didn't come at all, you cursed quietly but adjusted, planting later, using seeds that could take the cold, saving grain you might have eaten. Every year taught you something new, or reminded you of something forgotten. And because it was all stored in heads and hands, not pages, loss hit hard. When an old man died, the village lost more than a person. It lost when to prune the orchard, how to treat a cough, with mint and boiled nettle? Which patch of ground always stayed dry even in spring floods? These were not small things. They were survival. And so elders were respected not for status, but for memory. They had lived the hard seasons, seen what happened when you planted too soon or when the locusts came. They remembered when the rye failed and what they ate instead. Their stories weren't just entertainment, they were warnings in disguise. And children learned to listen because someday they'd need to carry that same weight. It was a knowledge that didn't make anyone rich but kept them alive. It didn't earn praise, but it earned another season. And in the end, that's all survival really was. Remembering enough of what came before to make it through what comes next. In a world where nothing was promised, no rain, no harvest, no mercy, memory was your anchor. And every time you dug your hands into the soil, you were reaching not just for food, but for the wisdom of all those who came before and who left behind their truths, not in ink, but in the way the earth responded. Death was not a stranger in the village. It was a neighbor. It passed by often, sometimes quietly, sometimes with noise, but always with familiarity. You didn't learn to fear it as much as you learned to live beside it. Children saw it early. Birds fallen from nests, lambs that didn't survive the frost, grandparents who slipped into stillness after a cough or a fall. There was grief, of course, but there was no room for denial. Death didn't come wrapped in ceremony or explanation. It came as part of the rhythm. You didn't ask why so much as you asked how to go on. And when someone died, it wasn't about announcements or gravestones. It was about what needed to be done next. You washed the body if you were family. You said prayers over it, even if your voice cracked. You helped carry it if you were strong enough. The dead were mourned not with elegies, but with quiet gestures. Bread shared with their kin, extra work taken on, so their tasks wouldn't go undone. A story told in their name by the fire a week later. And the burial itself, plain and practical, was done with the weight of sorrow and the calm of routine. The grave was dug by hands that might have planted turnips in the same soil. The prayers were short, familiar, worn from use. There were no elaborate markers, only wooden crosses or stones. But memory lingered in the way someone looked toward that patch of earth every time they passed it. The churchyard grew slowly, unevenly, but always close. You could see it from your door. It reminded you of where you came from and where you'd go. And while the fear of dying was real, especially in times of plague, when people vanished like smoke, it was the fear of leaving others behind that weighed heavier. Who would tend the goats, split the firewood, carry water from the stream? You didn't fear oblivion so much as you feared disruption. So people prepared, not with wills or documents, but with conversations and habits. A father might show his son where the tools were kept. A mother might teach her daughter how to measure flour by eye. These were the inheritances that mattered. And when death came in waves, as it did in plague years, you learned to grieve quickly, to pray faster, to go on while numb. You didn't stop living. You couldn't. The field still needed turning, the animals still needed feed. Even with tears in your eyes, your hands moved. There was no other choice. But over time, the sorrow softened into remembrance. Names stayed on people's lips long after their breath was gone. You spoke of them when the bread turned out well, or when the weather matched that strange spring. And in this way, the dead remained, woven into daily life, not lost, but transformed. They became part of the rhythm, like sunrise or rain. Their absence shaped the village as much as their presence once did. You didn't learn about medicine from a book. You learned it from watching someone crush leaves into paste or wrap a cloth soaked in vinegar around a burn. Healing, in the village, was less about cures and more about care. There were no doctors, not the kind with gowns and instruments. There were women, often older, often quiet, who knew which herbs to boil for fever and which roots to chew when your gut twisted from bad bread. They weren't always liked, and they were rarely thanked, but they were needed. People came to them in whispers, offering eggs or wool in exchange for advice. These women didn't claim to understand illness, only how to ease it. A fever meant willow bark. A cough meant thyme and honey if you had it. If a wound went black, you prayed. If a baby wouldn't cry, you begged. There were saints to ask for help. Saint Sebastian for plague, Saint Roch for sores, but mostly you relied on those few in the village who had seen it all before. Remedies were passed down like recipes, altered by memory and urgency. A hot stone placed near a swollen joint. A poultice made from mud and dandelion. A charm tied with string and spoken over. Belief was part of the treatment. Not blind belief, but hopeful belief, the kind you turned to when nothing else worked. And it wasn't just the body that needed tending. Illness made people feel afraid, unclean, even cursed. So healing also meant kindness. Someone sitting beside you, someone changing your linens, someone lighting a candle and keeping it burning. That mattered as much as any herb. Still, sickness was unpredictable. It came and went like a bad wind. A sniffle could be nothing, or it could be the start of something that took half the village. When plague came, it moved fast. You'd hear coughing one day, silence the next. People vanished behind doors. Those who stayed well avoided those who didn't, and guilt grew like mold. Sometimes the healers fell first, worn down by exposure, exhausted by care, and then people turned to prayer or to desperation. They tried things that had never worked before. Hanging garlic from rafters, burning old clothes, covering mouths with damp cloth. Anything to make it stop. Anything to feel like they were doing something. When it passed, there was no celebration. Just silence and a few more empty beds. The survivors went back to work, slower now, older in spirit. They spoke the names of those they'd lost as part of conversation, not ceremony. Not because they were gone, but because they had once been there. Healing, in truth, was rarely complete. Scars stayed. Limps stayed. The grief lingered. But life crept back in through the cracks. A laugh returned. A child was born. A pot of stew didn't go untouched. And in that fragile return to routine, you understood the most ancient truth of all. Healing was never about erasing pain. It was about learning how to carry it without falling. There was a kind of education in the village, though you'd never call it that. No chalkboards, no desks, no recitations, just life, and the necessity of knowing how to live it. Children learned with their eyes and their hands. They learned by watching their mothers gut a chicken or mend a boot. They learned by following their fathers to the field and copying the angle of a hoe, the rhythm of a swing. By the time a child could walk, they were already helping, gathering eggs, fetching water, collecting kindling. It wasn't formal, it wasn't praised, but it was essential. You had to know how to keep the fire going, how to tie a bundle tight, how to listen for a cartwheel's crack before it failed completely. The village taught you not to be clever, but to be useful. You weren't taught to dream, but to endure. Most didn't know their letters. Reading was a skill held by the church or the rare Lord's steward, and it wasn't seen as necessary for survival. What mattered more was knowing the weather by scent or the time by shadow. A child might not quote scripture, but they knew when the milk would turn or when the frost would kill the beans. That was wisdom. That was survival. And the stories told at night, over stew, near the hearth, those were lessons too. Cautionary tales of people who ignored warnings, who left the village without blessing, who mistreated their animals or mocked the spirits in the woods. Morality and memory were blended together, passed down in words too worn to question. They taught right from wrong without needing to define either. Even laughter taught something: who to trust, who was kind, how to tell when someone was lying by the way they scratched their nose. The learning never stopped, even if the body aged. An old man still noticed things a young one missed: how a tree tilted before it fell, how bees changed their flight when rain was near. A woman in her 70s knew more about stitches and bones than any noble physician. And though no one tested her on it, her proof was in the lives she had kept stitched together. Knowledge wasn't stored, it was lived. It moved from hand to hand, from moment to moment. You learned to carry it without realizing. And when someone died, their knowledge didn't disappear entirely. It lingered in the way others folded the laundry, or salted the meat, or avoided planting too close to the roots of the old elm. So while the village had no school, it had memory, it had rhythm, and it had a deep, quiet understanding of how things stayed alive, not through invention or ambition, but through attention. You didn't need parchment to learn what mattered. You needed presence. And presence was something even the youngest child learned before they learned their name. Because in this life, the lessons came fast, and forgetting them meant hunger, injury, or worse. So you remembered, because everyone did. There were no clocks in the village, only the sun and the rhythm it offered. Morning wasn't a number, it was when the rooster called, when the mist still hugged the ground and your breath lingered in the air. Evening wasn't a fixed hour, it was when the fields turned gold, when the last bundle was carried home, when smoke curled from cottage roofs. You measured time by what needed doing, when the bread was ready to rise, when the goats got restless, when the chill in the floorboards warned you the frost had returned. Days blended into each other like strokes in a painting, indistinct but full of motion. The calendar lived in the body more than in the mind, joints aching at the turn of seasons, calluses thickening with the grain cycle, coughs coming with the damp. And then there were feast days, the only things that interrupted the blur. Days set aside for saints, for harvest, for weddings, for rare joy. You marked them not with certainty, but with shared anticipation. Someone would mention it days in advance. The miller's wife might bake extra loaves. Children would grow jittery. And then, when it arrived, it changed everything. Work slowed. Laughter crept in. People washed their faces and wore cleaner tunics. It was like the world briefly remembered something lighter. These were the only moments when time felt like a guest, not a burden. You might dance, drink too much, or watch a puppet show brought by wandering performers. But just as quickly as it came, it would pass. And the next day, the mud would still need clearing. The thatch would still need patching. Time didn't pause. It didn't care. Sometimes you'd try to count the years by the number of winters your child had seen or how many stewards had come and gone. But mostly, you marked your life by events. The dry year, the summer when old Agnes broke her leg, the time the sky turned red and everyone waited to see if it meant something. You remembered in fragments. And when stories were told, time bent and folded. It was many years ago, someone would say, before the fire, after the flood, when Tom still had his hair. And everyone understood. Time wasn't linear. It was layered, worn into the walls of the cottage, pressed into the soil, stitched into the fabric of your tunic. There was no rush, but there was no rest either. Just motion. Just the quiet agreement to keep going, one season into the next. And sometimes, lying awake on a cold night, you wondered where it all went. The days were long, but the years slipped past like birds on a cloudy sky. noticeable only when they were gone. You might not remember the day your child first walked, but you'd remember how their hand felt in yours, that one harvest morning when the light came in just right. That was time, not kept, but felt, not measured, but lived. The forest wasn't just trees, it was a boundary, a provider, and a threat. It loomed beyond the edge of the fields like a living presence, old and watchful. By day, it offered fuel and forage, fallen branches, berries, wild garlic, the occasional rabbit if you had the patience or a snare. But by night, it transformed. Shadows thickened, branches groaned like voices, and the dark between the trunks felt bottomless. Everyone knew someone who had wandered too far and come back changed, or not at all. Children were warned with stories of spirits, of wolves, of things with eyes that didn't blink. But the truth was, you needed the forest. You learned its paths the way you learned a neighbor's moods, where it was safe to walk, where the ground softened and pulled at your boots, where the stinging nettles grew thick. It gave you firewood when no one else had warmth to spare. It gave you herbs the midwife couldn't grow. Sometimes, in desperate seasons, it gave you food that wasn't yours to take. Deer, wild pigs, even honey from bees nested deep in the hollow of an old elm. That kind of gathering came with risk. The forest belonged to the Lord, after all. It was his game, his trees, his land, even though your feet had walked it longer than his family's name had been spoken in your village. So when you took something, you didn't boast. You moved quiet. You shared only with those who wouldn't tell. Poaching wasn't just illegal. It was a gamble that could get you fined, imprisoned, or worse. But hunger made gamblers of everyone, and for some, the woods became a second home. You learned to listen to it. Birds falling silent before a storm, the rustle of boar through bramble, the shift in light that warned when dusk had come too quickly. The forest didn't lie, but it didn't forgive either. A wrong turn could leave you circling for hours, fear tightening in your chest. You might know the trees by name, but in fog or snow, everything looked unfamiliar. That was when people whispered prayers to old spirits, or left coins in the hollow stumps for safe return. It wasn't church-sanctioned, but it was older than scripture. Offerings for safety, gratitude for passage. And when you emerged from the trees, arms full, feet blistered, heart pounding, you felt something like triumph. Not just for what you carried, but for coming back. Because not everyone did. The forest kept its share. It was a place of balance, shelter and danger, silence and movement, blessing and warning. And even if you never said it aloud, you respected it. You left its edges with a bow of the head or a glance back over the shoulder. Because out there, under the thick canopy where the sun barely touched the ground, you understood that survival was never just about strength. It was about listening. It was about knowing when to take and when to ask. Silence in the village was not emptiness. It was presence. It filled the air between labor and laughter, between the clink of spoons and the creak of beams. It wasn't feared, it was familiar. There were entire hours where no one spoke. The fields didn't require conversation, only motion. The fire didn't demand words, just tending. Children grew up knowing when to be still, not out of discipline, but out of instinct. You didn't need to speak to understand what came next. A glance at the sky, a shift in the wind, the hush before a thunderstorm. These were messages everyone knew how to read. And in winter, silence thickened. Snow hushed everything. The animals moved less, people walked slower, and even the gossip quieted down. Words were used sparingly, as if breath itself was something to ration. But within that quiet, life continued. A child's cough in the night, the hiss of stew bubbling too fast, the slow rhythm of a loom. These were the background music of survival. When someone died, the village didn't erupt in grief. It folded inward. No wailing, no grand speeches, just fewer footsteps. A blanket of absence. You noticed it in the way old Marta's chair remained empty by the fire, or how her goat brayed a little louder without her hand. Morning was quiet. You marked it with gestures, baking her bread recipe, patching her fence, lighting a candle for her name. And when the silence settled deepest, usually after a long day or in the hour before dawn, it didn't feel lonely. It felt true, like the world was catching its breath. Sometimes you'd sit by the doorway, hands still, eyes watching the mist rise. And in that silence, you remembered things without meaning to. Your mother's song, the day your brother twisted his ankle, the first time you touched frost with bare fingers. Memory spoke loudest when nothing else did. Some silences were heavy, when food was low or illness hovered. In those moments, no one joked. Even the animals seemed subdued. You learned to read the air, to notice how people didn't meet eyes, or how the elder paused longer before answering. But other silences were gentle, like after a good harvest, when everyone was too tired to talk but too full to sleep. Then you shared a kind of peace that didn't need declaring. Words were a luxury in a world of labor. Most things were understood without them. And when you did speak, it meant more. A whispered thank you, a soft laugh, a story retold not for entertainment but for grounding, something old to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. You didn't fear the quiet. You walked with it, worked beside it, slept inside it. Because in a world so full of toil, silence wasn't absence, it was a kind of shelter. And it reminded you that not all strength needs to shout. Some strength is just the ability to sit still and keep going. Every season had its burden, but spring held the most tension, not because it was cruel like winter or punishing like harvest, but because it made promises, and promises could be broken. Spring came slowly to the village, shy and cautious, creeping in through softened earth and the first stubborn green shoots. The ground, once frozen and lifeless, turned muddy, then workable. There was hope in the thaw, but also anxiety. The stores were low by then, onions shriveled, grain stretched thin, nothing left of last autumn's feast but memory. You planted not because you were eager, but because you had no choice. The seeds had to go in. The weather had to hold. The sun had to return. You had no second chance. Tools were mended again and again, handles patched, blades resharpened until they were more notch than edge. Children helped, barefoot in the slush, carrying baskets of seed or clumps of manure. There was no waiting for perfection. If the field could be turned, it was turned, and every farmer's eye watched the sky like it held a secret. A late frost could ruin everything. A surprise storm could wash out the early sprouts. You couldn't control it. All you could do was hope the saints were listening and that last year's sins weren't being tallied in the clouds. Spring was also the season of births, lambs and calves, but also children. Babies born in the lean season were often weaker, their mothers thinner, their chances smaller. Still, they came. Midwives moved from hut to hut, carrying bundles of cloth and whispered prayers. A healthy cry in the early morning was enough to make even the oldest farmer pause in his work, just to listen. Life still pushed forward, even when the world groaned under the weight of its own hunger. The church bells, when they rang louder in spring. People dressed slightly better, washed a bit more, tried to shake off the long shadow of winter. Festivals returned, though modest. A maypole might be raised, garlands hung, songs sung with cracked voices that hadn't lifted in months. It was a strange, almost fragile joy, like the village had remembered it was alive. But behind every song was a silent accounting. How much seed remained? Would the rye take root? Would the barley stand tall? Everyone smiled, but everyone watched. Because if the spring failed, the rest of the year would be chasing ghosts, phantoms of crops that never grew, meals that never came, neighbors who wasted away by the next frost. And so spring became a test, not just of the land, but of faith. You had to believe without evidence that the soil would forgive you, that the rains would come gently, that the sun would warm without burning. You rose early, worked until dark, and whispered blessings into the furrows, because this season held no certainty, only effort, only hope. And in that quiet gamble, medieval life turned again, fragile, stubborn, and waiting to grow. The idea of wealth in the village wasn't measured by coin, it was measured by survival. Gold never touched your hands. Silver was something whispered about or worn by a lord on his passing horse. Your currency was different. A good harvest, a healthy cow, a roof that held through winter. Even a sharp tool was worth more than promises etched in parchment. You learned early that wealth wasn't a number, it was a feeling. The confidence of having a little extra grain tucked away. The quiet pride in giving your neighbor a cup of milk when her goat dried up. No one flaunted fortune because there was none to flaunt. If someone suddenly had more than they should, the village noticed. The questions came gently, then sharply. Had they found something, taken something, received help from someone outside? Because in a place where survival was shared, suspicion grew from imbalance. Yet even so, the village had its own version of generosity. A loaf left at a doorstep, extra thatch passed down before a storm, a hand offered when your fence collapsed or your child burned with fever. The gifts weren't grand, but they were timely, and that made them precious. On feast days, the poor received food, not because the rich were noble, but because it was expected. It was the shape of society. The top fed the bottom served the top, and the middle kept quiet. Wealth, when it passed through your world, passed quickly. A coin earned from a long day working the Lord's land might go straight to the miller for flour or the blacksmith for repairs. There was never enough to save. A few coins might be buried in a wooden box beneath the floorboards, not out of greed, but out of terror that something worse might come. And it always could. A sick animal, a broken roof, a tax collector in a bad mood. So you planned for nothing and prepared for everything. You bartered when you could. Wool for salt, eggs for thread, a morning of labor for a used tool. And in these small exchanges, trust was built, or broken. A man who lied about the weight of his grain might be fed last come famine. A woman who shared her harvest one year might find half her field planted by neighbors the next. Wealth was not a pile, it was a pattern of giving, of taking, of being seen and remembered. And even the poorest had something to offer. A song, a story, a strong back in the cold. Sometimes the one with the least was the one everyone turned to, because reliability was its own kind of richness. And in a world where fate swung wide and without warning, being remembered kindly was the only inheritance most peasants ever truly had. You didn't aim to be rich. You aimed to be missed. That was enough. There were no mirrors in the average peasant's home. Reflections came in puddles, in the still water of a bucket, or in the brief glint off a polished spoon. You did not grow up knowing your face the way we do now. You knew your hands better, where the calluses were deepest, where the skin cracked in winter, how the nails darkened with soil that never quite scrubbed out. Your body wasn't something to admire, it was something to use. You judged it by its usefulness. Could your legs carry you to the next field and back? Could your arms lift what needed lifting? Could your stomach hold food when it came and keep quiet when it didn't? No one asked if you liked how you looked. There were no portraits, no powders, no cosmetics beyond what nature smudged across your skin. A red flush from the cold, a streak of ash from the hearth, a bruise from a fall. All of it faded in time. Grooming was simple and functional. You might comb your hair with carved wood or animal bone, but washing was a luxury, done with river water or rain, cold and bracing, and not every day. Soap was rare and scratchy. Lye stung the hands that made it. Clothing followed the same logic. Layers of wool, coarse linen, leather if you were lucky. Not tailored to flatter, but to endure. Tunics patched until the original fabric was nearly gone. Aprons stiff with use. Every item worn down by repetition, by duty, by time. And yet, there was pride, not in fashion, but in care. A clean tunic on a feast day. Braided hair for a wedding. Fresh rushes laid over the damp floor for a guest. These small acts were gestures of dignity. In them, you said, I am still here. I still care. Even if the world sees dirt and rags, I know what I've kept clean. Illness could take your looks swiftly. Swelling, boils, pox, coughs that hollowed your cheeks. Teeth rotted early. Eyes dimmed from smoke and strain. No one expected beauty to last, if it came at all. You didn't fear age because you didn't expect to reach it. Gray hair was uncommon not because it was rare, but because most didn't live long enough to grow it, and those who did were often revered, not as wise sages, but as survivors. Their faces told stories in wrinkles. Each scar had a name. Each limp came from a day remembered. In the village, you didn't need to be beautiful. You needed to be known. That was the real mirror, how others spoke your name, how they recalled your laugh, your hands, your place at the table. You didn't grow up watching yourself change. You grew up changing things, fields, fences, fortunes, and letting the years mark you however they pleased. And when someone described you, they rarely mentioned your face. They spoke of your work, your voice, your steadiness, and in that, you lived on. There was always a place in the village where the sick were sent. It wasn't a hospital, no white sheets or rows of beds. More often, it was a spare hut, half fallen in or barely warm, where someone too ill to work was placed with a blanket and a basin of water. You didn't go there unless you had to. It smelled of fever, rot, and the sour ache of hopelessness. And yet people survived there sometimes. The body, when allowed to rest, could rally in strange and miraculous ways. But many times, it was just the waiting place, for the fever to break or for life to fade. No one expected miracles. You did what you could. You brought broth, changed cloths, muttered prayers. Herbs hung from the rafters, drying in clusters, sage for strength, yarrow for wounds, garlic for protection. Women, mothers, widows, healers, knew the signs. They didn't speak them aloud, but you could see it in their eyes when they glanced at a patient and gave a slow, quiet nod. That meant it was time to prepare, not to hope. There were no masks, no gloves. Illness passed through families like a whisper, touching one, skipping another, then returning. You accepted the risk. If someone you loved was sick, you stayed. You tended. Even if it meant coughing days later yourself. Children learned early how to wring out cloths and recognize fevered eyes. And still, there was kindness. A hand on a forehead, a cool rag, A lullaby murmured through cracked lips. You gave what you could, even when it might not help, because doing something, anything, felt better than waiting. And sometimes the sick did recover. They woke after days of sleep, thin and shaking, but alive. Their return to the village was quiet, marked by small smiles and stronger soup. Recovery meant weakness for weeks, sometimes months. But it also meant resilience. You remembered who had returned from the brink. Their presence became a kind of quiet encouragement when someone else fell ill. If they survived, maybe I will too. When death came, it did not always come violently. Sometimes it was just a slowing, a shallow breath, then none. The body was washed gently, the eyes closed, and the name whispered aloud, not to summon them back, but to guide them on. Burials were swift. The earth was always ready. Graves were dug with quiet precision, the village gathering in heavy silence, not for ceremony, but for solidarity. A handful of prayers, a glance toward the sky. Then life resumed. A fence needed mending, a stew needed stirring. Grief didn't pause the seasons, but the memory stayed. In a nickname passed down, a story repeated, a patch of earth avoided for a while. The place where the sick went wasn't marked on any map, but everyone knew it, everyone feared it, and everyone at some point had sat beside its door, waiting to see which way the story would end. Among the most sacred spaces in the village was not the chapel or the steward's hall, it was the shared oven. It sat near the center of the settlement, built of stone and clay, domed and smoke-blackened, its mouth yawning open like the furnace of some old god. It was not beautiful, but it was necessary. Firewood was precious, and so were the coals it held. Every family took their turn, hauling flat loaves wrapped in cloth, tucked under arms or balanced on boards, waiting for their chance to bake. The schedule wasn't written down, it was remembered, passed along by habit and hush. You learned when your family's slot came. You showed up on time, or you waited. The oven was a communal miracle. One blaze, many mouths. When it was fired up, the whole village seemed to lean toward it, noses catching the rare scent of baking rye or barley, steam rising into the cold morning air. Bread was survival, not pleasure, not indulgence, just heat and grain, transformed into something edible. The crust was dark and cracked, the inside dense, sometimes sour, but it filled the belly. You rationed each loaf like treasure, slicing it thinner when the harvest failed, or mixing in dried peas or bark to stretch the dough when stores ran low. In harsh winters or poor years, you brought strange things to the oven: acorn paste, ground roots, mashed weeds, even dustings of dried nettle, anything that might hold together under heat and hold hunger at bay. No one judged. Everyone understood. A burnt crust wasn't waste, it was scraped, softened with broth, soaked into pottage. Nothing edible was ever truly discarded, and in that oven there was also quiet comfort. The moment when your bread was done, lifted out with a wooden paddle, heat rushing over your face, the scent warming your chest, you felt, if only briefly, a sense of triumph. You had made something. You had taken flour and fire and turned them into life. Children clustered near the oven, not just for warmth, but for stories. The old women shared tales as the bread baked, of saints who wept over spilled flour, of spirits who snuck crumbs to the starving, of winters where only crusts stood between families and silence. The oven was not merely a hearth, it was a gathering place, a promise that no one cooked alone. If someone fell ill, a neighbor baked their share. If a family lost their stores, someone found a way to stretch theirs a little further. No one said the word charity, but it happened anyway, quietly, regularly, because even the poorest understood that hunger was a tide, It came for everyone eventually. And when the oven cracked or the chimney collapsed, the whole village mourned. They rebuilt it with care, stone by stone, ash in their hair, soot on their hands. Because without it, life was colder, harder, more alone. And with it, even a single loaf felt like hope, baked golden and steaming at the edge of the world. There was a time each year when the land seemed to forget you, and that was the hardest season of all. Late winter, early spring, the hungry gap, they called it, when the root cellar echoed and the stored grain turned to dust or mold, when the fields were not yet green and the animals were thin, ribs showing under their coats. Nothing grew, nothing lasted. You scraped the bottom of every barrel, dug through sacks for missed kernels, watered down every pot of pottage until it was more memory than meal. And still, the hunger came. It made you slow, but not soft. You learned to stretch meals, to chew longer. You told your children stories during supper, not to distract them, but to slow their hands. There was no shame in it. Everyone was hungry. Even the steward's stores grew lean, his temper shorter. Hunger equalized things in a quiet, terrible way. The hungry gap wasn't a single event. It was a creeping presence. You went to bed with it. You woke up with it. You worked through it. Tasks took longer. Arguments sparked faster. But you survived it the way you always did, together, mostly in silence. The herbalist walked more slowly. The village elder gave fewer speeches. The church bells rang less often, either out of mercy or weakness. Prayer came easier when your belly was hollow. And somehow, through the ache and the fog, a kind of fierce clarity would emerge. You could feel every part of yourself working to endure. The muscles in your legs as you walked, the skin stretched across your ribs, the careful counting of each seed in your palm as planting season approached. Hope became a seed, not an emotion. You measured your life not in time, but in how many weeks until the nettles came back, until the hens laid again, until the sun was warm enough to coax the barley through the soil. And then, almost cruelly, it changed. A bud on a tree, a pale green shoot in the thatch, a morning where your breath didn't fog in the air. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in hesitantly, like someone unsure they were welcome. But when it came, it was everything. The relief was quiet too. You didn't cheer. You just dug deeper, worked faster, made up for lost time. You'd survived another year's edge. You wouldn't celebrate until the harvest, and even then, only a little. But for a moment, standing at the edge of your field, with dirt under your nails and warmth on your back, you let yourself believe that things might be all right, for now. Because that was the secret of peasant survival. Not the absence of hardship, but the slow, stubborn refusal to give in to it. Not today, not yet. There comes a point, if you're lucky, when your hands no longer ache quite so sharply in the morning, because you've learned how to move with the pain, not against it. The fields haven't changed. The seasons still come with their teeth bared, but you have learned how to bend with them. You have learned the land's language, not in words, but in weather, in soil, in the tilt of the wind. You know what it means when the birds go quiet or when the sheep won't settle. You know how to patch a roof before the storm hits, how to coax barley from tired soil, how to carry grief without letting it stop your chores. This wisdom isn't written down. It isn't rewarded, but it stays with you, stitched into your bones like warmth into wool. You are no longer the child who feared the dark forest or the strange cough. You've watched enough seasons turn to know that fear is always there, but so is endurance. You've seen hunger hollow the strongest, and you've seen a single loaf shared in silence keep a family going. You've lost people, friends, children, animals, and you've gone on living because there was no other choice. You've whispered prayers over graves, over meals, over blisters. You've seen the world from the same patch of ground for decades and still find mystery in the sunrise. And maybe that's what survival really is. Not just food or shelter or even health, but the ability to keep going in the face of everything, to keep planting even when the last harvest failed, to keep loving even when the losses accumulate, to keep believing that next spring might be kinder. In the end, no one will write your name down in the royal records. No statue will be carved in your likeness, but the paths you wore into the earth will remain. The tools you shaped, the bread you baked, the children you raised, these will outlast you. And in that, there's something like immortality. The world will go on spinning its quiet, brutal rhythm, but you were part of it. You left something behind. And as the fire dies down, as the sky darkens beyond the thatch, you lie back on a straw mattress and let your body rest. You've done enough for one life. You've carried the weight of centuries in silence. And now, at last, you let it go. Not in glory, not in triumph, but in peace. Because sometimes the quietest lives are the strongest, and the ones who endure without recognition are the ones who held everything together.